folks. Look at this. Live tyranny at gate B12.
Sir, you can't block the boarding lane. Step to the side for me, please.
Oh, I'm not blocking anything. I'm exercising my rights. See this? Article 7, section right there. Read it.
I'm not going to read your phone, sir. Move out of the lane or you're going to be escorted out.
Hear that? Escorted out, not moving.
I am traveling, not engaging in commerce, officer, Harrington declared, holding his phone aloft to capture every moment for his live stream. As a free inhabitant under the Articles of Confederation, which were never properly repealed, I have all the rights of a citizen without the legal obligations. Officer Mendoza's expression remained neutral, though her eyes briefly flicked toward the growing line of frustrated passengers. Sir, regardless of your beliefs, you need a valid ticket to board this aircraft, she replied calmly, positioning herself between him and the jetway entrance. The familiar chime of airport announcements punctuated the tense standoff at Gate A4, where United Flight 1624 to Chicago was in the final stages of boarding. Officer Vanessa Mendoza had responded to the urgent call from the gate agent about a passenger refusing to comply with boarding procedures and creating a disturbance. The call had come through as a Code 2, urgent but not an emergency. Though as Mendoza took in the scene, she noted the growing agitation among the waiting passengers and the flush of frustration on the gate agent's face. Behind her, the digital display showed the flight status as boarding with a departure time only 30 minutes away. Let us know in the comments if you think the officer handled this correctly. Subscribe for more body cam breakdowns. I have documentation of my reservation right here, Harrington insisted, thrusting forward his phone screen displaying what appeared to be an Expedia search result from 2018. The timestamp on the screenshot was clearly visible in the corner, showing a date from 5 years prior, though Harrington's thumb strategically attempted to obscure it. Elena Parker, the United Airlines gate agent whose name badge gleamed under the fluorescent lighting, shook her head with the practiced patience of someone who had encountered difficult passengers before, though perhaps none quite like this. Sir, I've checked our system thoroughly, and there is no reservation under your name for this flight or any flight today, she explained, her voice professional but firm. Harrington adjusted his navy blazer, revealing more of the "Taxation is Theft" t-shirt underneath, and turned his attention fully to Officer Mendoza while still holding his phone to record. This woman is attempting to defraud me of my lawful conveyance after I established a verbal contract of carriage with Greg this morning, he declared, his voice rising to ensure nearby passengers could hear. Officer Mendoza noted there was no employee named Greg working at this particular gate today, a fact she had confirmed upon arrival. My strawman corporation, Mitchell Harrington, all capital letters, may not appear in your system, but the flesh and blood Mitchell, Harrington, has the right to travel unimpeded under natural law, he continued, his speech pattern adopting the peculiar syntax Mendoza recognized from previous encounters with sovereign citizen adherence. The line of passengers behind Harrington had grown visibly restless, with several checking watches and phones, their expressions darkening as the confrontation continued to block their path. Sir, I need you to step aside so these other passengers can board, Mendoza stated, using the measured tone she had developed during her crisis intervention team training. Her 14 years with the Denver Police Department had taught her that maintaining calm was essential, particularly in the fishbowl environment of an airport terminal where any scene could quickly become a spectacle. I understand you believe you have a right to board, but without a valid ticket in the system, you cannot proceed past this point, she continued, maintaining eye contact while subtly positioning herself to block any potential attempt to rush the jetway door. Harrington scoffed and raised his voice further, clearly playing to his audience both present and virtual. I do not need a ticket in the system, as you call it, because I have the email screenshot which constitutes title to the seat, he declared, as if explaining a simple concept to a child. The metal clipboard he carried, which he had earlier referred to as his court of record, was now tucked under his arm as he gesticulated with his free hand. I am a first-class passenger and demand to be treated as such, he insisted, despite the screenshot clearly showing a search for economy seating. I've got 3,000 people watching this live stream right now, and they all see how United Airlines is violating my rights under Title 18 USC and the Uniform Commercial Code, he added, glancing at his phone screen where comments from viewers were rapidly scrolling. Officer Mendoza's radio crackled softly at her shoulder, a reminder that backup was available if needed, though she hoped to resolve this without escalation. Mr. Harrington, I'm Officer Mendoza with the Denver Police Department Airport Unit, she began, formally introducing herself to establish the official nature of the interaction. Her body camera, standard equipment for all DPD officers, recorded the encounter from her perspective, capturing both audio and video that would later become crucial evidence. I need to see some identification, please, she requested, knowing this would likely trigger another round of sovereign citizen rhetoric, but needing to formally establish his identity. As expected, Harrington's posture stiffened at the request. I am not required to identify myself to you as I am not engaging in commerce or criminal activity, he replied, his tone shifting to one of rehearsed legal-sounding jargon. Behind him, a businessman in a charcoal suit sighed audibly and checked his watch again while a family with young children whispered anxiously about making their connection. I am not driving a commercial vehicle, I am not engaged in interstate commerce, and I do not consent to joinder with your corporate entity. Harrington continued using phrases common to sovereign citizen ideology that Mendoza had encountered in training bulletins about dealing with such individuals. Elena Parker, the gate agent, stepped forward with renewed determination, her United Airlines uniform crisp despite the long day. Sir, Flight 1624 is boarding now, and these passengers have confirmed reservations, she said, gesturing to the line behind him. Her years of experience showed in her calm demeanor, though Mendoza could see the tension in her shoulders. If you don't have a valid ticket, you need to step aside immediately, or I'll have to ask Officer Mendoza to remove you from the gate area, she added, making it clear that Harrington's options were narrowing. Harrington's face flushed with indignation as he pivoted his phone to capture the gate agent's face. I do not consent to being recorded, Elena stated immediately, raising her hand to block his view. The gesture seemed to inflame Harrington further as he turned back to Mendoza, his voice rising to a near shout. This is corporate tyranny supported by police enforcement, he declared, eyes darting between Mendoza and his live stream audience. I made a verbal contract with Greg, and under the UCC, verbal contracts are binding when witnessed. And I have 3,000 witnesses right here, he insisted, tapping his phone screen where comments continued to scroll, mostly variations of encouragement to stand your ground and don't let them violate your rights. Officer Mendoza recognized that the situation was becoming a performance for Harrington's online audience, a common tactic among self-described First Amendment auditors looking to provoke reactions from authority figures. Sir, regardless of what you believe about verbal contracts, United Airlines has no record of any reservation for you on this flight, she explained, her tone remaining professional despite Harrington's increasing agitation. The Denver International Airport's vast Terminal B stretched behind them, its distinctive white tinsel roof visible through the massive windows, a reminder of the public setting in which this confrontation was unfolding. You need to step aside now and take this matter to the United Customer Service Desk if you wish to pursue it further, she added, gesturing toward the main terminal area. Instead of complying, Harrington widened his stance, physically blocking more of the boarding lane. I do not recognize your authority to remove me from public accommodation, he stated, his voice taking on a rehearsed quality that suggested he had prepared for this very scenario. His self-published book on legal strategies, Mendoza would later learn, included an entire chapter on airport confrontations. Under the Articles of Confederation, which were never properly repealed, I have all the rights of a citizen without the legal obligations, he repeated, seemingly reading from a mental script. "I demand to speak to your supervisor immediately and require your bond number for my records," he added, using terminology common among sovereign citizens who believed that all government officials were bonded and could be held personally liable through financial claims. The final boarding call for Flight 1624 echoed through the gate area, adding urgency to the already tense situation. "This is the final boarding call for United Airlines Flight 1624 to Chicago O'Hare," announced the automated system, prompting anxious murmurs from the remaining passengers still waiting to board. Elena stepped away briefly to speak into her radio, likely updating her supervisor about the ongoing situation that was now threatening the on-time departure of the flight. "Sir, you're preventing these passengers from boarding their flight," Mendoza pointed out, hoping to appeal to some sense of consideration for others, though her experience with sovereign citizens suggested this approach might be futile. "I'm not preventing anyone from boarding," Harrington countered, though he made no move to step aside from his position directly in front of the boarding lane. His phone remained held high, capturing every moment of the confrontation for his audience. "They're free to board once United Airlines honors my verbal contract of carriage," he added, his logic circular and self-serving. The passengers behind him exchanged glances of disbelief and growing anger, with several now openly complaining to each other about the delay. Officer Mendoza made a subtle hand signal to Elena, who understood immediately and began quietly directing passengers to form a second line at the adjacent desk. "Sir, what exactly did this Greg person tell you this morning?" Mendoza asked, both to gather information and to keep Harrington engaged while the gate agent worked to get passengers boarded through an alternative route. The strategic question seemed to please Harrington, who took it as an opportunity to elaborate on his narrative. "Greg, the United representative, verbally confirmed my standing reservation this morning at approximately 900 hours, he stated with unwarranted precision, despite the fact that no record of such an interaction existed. Harrington adjusted his posture, puffing out his chest slightly, as he continued his explanation with the confidence of someone deeply invested in their own fabrication. Greg acknowledged my Article 4 free inhabitant status and confirmed that my screenshot constitutes a binding reservation under Admiralty law, which governs all air travel as it does maritime transportation, he declared, his voice taking on the cadence of someone reciting memorized text. Behind him, Elena was efficiently scanning boarding passes at the second position, quietly ushering passengers onto the plane, while Harrington remained distracted by his opportunity to expound on his pseudo-legal theories to Officer Mendoza and his online audience. "Can you describe this Greg person for me?" Mendoza asked, maintaining the conversation while observing that approximately half the remaining passengers had now been redirected to the alternative boarding path. Her question seemed to momentarily fluster Harrington, whose description remained vague and inconsistent. He was a uniformed United representative, approximately 40 years old, who understood the law better than most corporate agents, he replied, conspicuously avoiding any specific physical details that might allow for identification of this supposedly real employee. The live-stream comments continued to scroll on Harrington's phone screen, with supporters offering encouragement and suggestions for additional legal-sounding phrases he might employ. "Tell her about your status as a secured party creditor," one comment read, while another advised, "Demand to see her oath of office." Harrington, clearly energized by this virtual support, squared his shoulders and addressed Mendoza with renewed confidence. "I need to see your bond number and your oath of office before we proceed any further with this interaction," he demanded, his tone suggesting he believed this request would somehow stymie her authority. Officer Mendoza had encountered this tactic before during her 14 years with the department, particularly in the last few years, as sovereign citizen ideology had spread through social media and self-published guides. "Sir, I'm Officer Vanessa Mendoza, badge number 4573, with the Denver Police Department Airport Unit," she stated calmly, providing her official identification while sidestepping the nonsensical request for a bond number. Her measured response seemed to briefly confuse Harrington, who had clearly expected resistance that would allow him to escalate his performance for his audience. Recovering quickly, Harrington reached into his jacket and produced a document from his metal clipboard, which he held forward with the ceremonial gravity of someone delivering a royal proclamation. "I hereby serve you with the notice that I am a living, breathing man, not a corporate entity, and I do not consent to your admiralty jurisdiction," he declared, attempting to hand the document to Mendoza. The paper, printed on what appeared to be standard office stock, but embellished with an ornate border and several unofficial-looking stamps, was precisely the type of pseudo-legal document that Mendoza had been briefed about in training sessions about sovereign citizen encounters. "I'm not accepting service of documents at this time," Mendoza stated firmly, keeping her hands at her sides and not reaching for the paper. Behind Harrington, Elena had successfully managed to board nearly all the remaining passengers, with only a few stragglers still waiting their turn. "Sir, you're currently impeding airport operations and preventing the on-time departure of this flight," Mendoza continued, shifting the conversation back to the practical reality of the situation, rather than engaging with his sovereign citizen mythology. Harrington's face flushed deeper as he realized his audience was literally disappearing behind him, boarding the plane despite his blockade. "Those passengers are violating my contractual right to board first," he protested, turning briefly to see the nearly empty gate area where only minutes before a line of frustrated travelers had stood. His momentary distraction gave Mendoza an opportunity to subtly position herself between Harrington and the remaining few passengers, creating a human shield that allowed the final travelers to quickly move past and board. "You're causing a scene in a secure area of the airport," Mendoza stated, her tone firmer now that the immediate concern of getting legitimate passengers boarded was nearly resolved. The change in her demeanor was subtle, but clear. The time for patient conversation was transitioning toward enforcement. "I need you to either produce a valid boarding pass for this flight or leave the gate area immediately," she continued, establishing clear expectations and consequences. Harrington sensed the shift and seemed to calculate his next move, glancing between Mendoza, his phone where comments continued to encourage his defiance, and the now empty boarding lane behind him. "I do not need a boarding pass as commonly understood by corporate policy," he insisted, though his voice carried a new note of uncertainty beneath the bravado. His free hand moved to his clipboard again, retrieving another document that appeared to be a homemade identification card featuring a photograph of himself against a background of constitutional text. "This is my diplomatic identification as a sovereign free inhabitant," Harrington declared, holding up the laminated card that bore no official government or airline insignia. The card, clearly self-produced, featured multiple seals and stamps that mimicked official documentation, but would be immediately recognizable as fraudulent to any trained eye. "This identification supersedes any requirement for a corporate boarding pass," he continued, his performance becoming increasingly desperate as Elena announced the final boarding call for Flight 1624. Officer Mendoza's radio crackled again, and she heard the voice of her supervisor, Sergeant Carlos Martinez, inquiring about the situation at Gate A4. "Code 4 for now," she responded quietly into her shoulder mic, indicating that the situation was under control, but that she would appreciate backup standing by. The standard police code was unlikely to be understood by Harrington, giving Mendoza a moment of private communication amid the public confrontation. "Mr. Harrington, let me be very clear," Mendoza stated, her voice calm but authoritative as she addressed both the man before her and the record being created by her body camera. You do not have a valid ticket for this flight. You are currently trespassing in a secure area of the airport, and you need to leave the gate area immediately," she continued, laying out the situation in unambiguous terms. Behind them, Elena was preparing to close the boarding door, the last legitimate passenger having successfully made it onto the aircraft, despite Harrington's obstruction. Harrington's expression darkened as he realized his performance was failing to achieve his desired outcome. "I am not trespassing as this is a public accommodation," he argued, his voice rising again as he sensed his control of the situation slipping. His phone, still recording the encounter, was now held even higher, as if the angle might somehow change the reality of his circumstances. "I have a right to travel that predates your corporate regulations," he insisted, repeating phrases that appeared frequently in sovereign citizen literature. Officer Mendoza took a deliberate step forward, reducing the distance between them without entering his personal space. "Sir, Denver International Airport is indeed public property, but access to secure areas like this gate requires compliance with Transportation Security Administration regulations and airline boarding procedures," she explained, her tone reminiscent of her days providing security briefings during her Air Force service. The clear explanation seemed to momentarily pierce Harrington's rhetorical armor as he blinked rapidly and shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "This is your final opportunity to leave the gate area voluntarily," Mendoza stated, making the consequence of continued defiance implicit in her tone. Behind her, Elena had now closed the door to the jetway, signaling that Flight 1624 was sealed and preparing for departure. The digital display above the gate had changed from boarding to departed, though the aircraft remained at the gate completing final preparations. Harrington's live stream comments continued to scroll, with some viewers now advising him to comply temporarily and fight this in Admiralty Court later. Others, however, encouraged continued defiance, creating a virtual chorus of contradictory advice that seemed to further confuse his already muddled strategy. "I will leave under protest and duress," he finally declared, apparently selecting a phrase he believed would preserve some imagined legal position while allowing him to avoid immediate arrest. Officer Mendoza nodded once, accepting this face-saving concession while remaining vigilant for any sudden changes in his demeanor or intentions. "Please proceed to the main terminal area," she directed, gesturing toward the concourse that led away from the gate. Harrington took a step backward, maintaining his phone's recording angle, but then paused as a new thought seemed to occur to him. "I demand the full names and employee identification numbers of everyone involved in this conspiracy against my right to travel," he stated, turning briefly toward Elena, who was now completing paperwork at the gate desk. The gate agent deliberately turned away, focusing on her terminal and ignoring the demand. "I'll be filing a commercial lien against United Airlines and the City of Denver for violation of my rights under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights," Harrington added, his voice carrying the practiced certainty of someone who had issued such meaningless threats before. Officer Mendoza remained steady, neither responding to the threat nor appearing concerned by it. "Sir, please proceed to the main terminal now," she repeated, her instruction leaving no room for further debate. With visible reluctance, Harrington finally began moving away from the gate area, though he continued to narrate his departure for his live stream audience, describing it as a tactical retreat rather than compliance with lawful instructions. As Harrington moved toward the main terminal, his pace was deliberately slow, his phone still held high to capture every moment for his viewers. "I'm being forcibly removed from my rightful conveyance, patriots," he narrated to his audience, though no physical force had been applied. Officer Mendoza maintained a professional distance behind him, ensuring he continued moving away from the secure gate area, while remaining close enough to intervene if he attempted to return or create further disturbances. The bustling concourse of Denver International Airport stretched before them, its high ceilings and massive windows creating an open atmosphere that contrasted with the tension of the immediate situation. This officer is violating my right to travel freely as guaranteed under the Articles of Confederation, Harrington continued, his voice pitched to carry to nearby travelers who glanced curiously at the unusual procession. A small crowd had begun to form, drawn by Harrington's theatrical declarations and the presence of a uniformed officer, creating exactly the public spectacle that Mendoza had hoped to avoid. "Look at how many people are witnessing this violation of natural law," Harrington declared, panning his phone camera across the gathering onlookers. The livestream comment count had grown to over 4,000 viewers, with the chat moving so quickly that individual messages were barely readable. "They can't arrest all of us for standing up for our rights," he added, though no one in the impromptu audience showed any sign of joining his cause. Officer Mendoza maintained her calm exterior while inwardly calculating the best approach to minimize the disruption. "Sir, please lower your voice in the terminal," she instructed, keeping her own tone measured and professional. Her request seemed to have the opposite effect, as Harrington immediately increased his volume, seemingly energized by the growing audience, both in person and virtual. "I do not have to comply with unlawful directives," he shouted, causing several nearby passengers to step back in alarm. His performance had taken on a new intensity, perhaps fueled by the failure of his original plan to board the aircraft. "This officer is attempting to silence my First Amendment. Protected speech," he continued at the same elevated volume, spinning to face Mendoza directly while continuing to record. Mendoza's radio crackled again, and she heard Sergeant Martinez's voice. "Backup approaching your location, Mendoza." The knowledge that support was nearby allowed her to maintain her composed approach despite Harrington's escalating behavior. "Sir, you have the right to express your views, but creating a disturbance in the airport is a violation of Municipal Code 38-146, she stated calmly, referencing the specific ordinance that prohibited disruptive behavior in airport facilities. Harrington scoffed audibly at the citation of law. "I don't consent to your corporate statutes and codes," he declared, his voice still raised, though slightly lower than his previous shout. The metal clipboard he carried was now thrust forward like a shield between them, as if the documents it contained might somehow ward off the authority Mendoza represented. "I only recognize common law and the original Constitution before it was subverted by the corporation known as the United States of America, all capitals," he added, emphasizing the capitalization verbally as if it carried legal significance. From the corner of her eye, Mendoza spotted Sergeant Martinez approaching with another officer, their presence providing a tactical advantage without immediately escalating the situation. "Mr. Harrington, I need you to calm down and lower your voice," she repeated, maintaining eye contact despite his camera still recording her face. Behind him, several travelers had stopped to record the interaction on their own phones, creating a multi-layered documentation of the unfolding scene. "I am perfectly calm and exercising my right to free speech," Harrington replied, though his flushed face and tense posture suggested otherwise. He had begun to perspire visibly, dark patches forming under the arms of his navy blazer despite the airport's climate control. "My audience deserves to know how travelers are being oppressed in this corporate venue," he continued, glancing at his phone screen where encouragement from his viewers continued to flow. Sergeant Martinez positioned himself strategically to the side, visible to Mendoza, but not immediately apparent to Harrington, who remained focused on his confrontation with the female officer. "Sir, I understand you're upset about not being able to board your flight," Mendoza stated, deliberately shifting the conversation back to the practical reality rather than engaging with his sovereign citizen ideology. The approach was a standard de-escalation technique from her crisis intervention team training. Acknowledge the emotion, redirect to concrete issues, Harrington's response was immediate and predictable. "I'm not upset. I'm standing on my natural rights as a free inhabitant," he insisted, though his tone betrayed his frustration. A notification sound from his phone momentarily distracted him, and he glanced down to see a message from one of his viewers suggesting he demand to see the contract you supposedly violated. Taking the cue from his audience, Harrington pivoted to a new line of rhetoric. "I demand to see the contract that gives you jurisdiction over my person," he stated, as if reciting from a script. The request, nonsensical in the context of law enforcement in a public facility, was another standard sovereign citizen tactic that Mendoza recognized from her training. "Show me where I signed away my natural rights to your corporate enforcement apparatus," he continued, seemingly pleased with the phrasing. "Sir, I'm not here to debate legal philosophy," Mendoza replied, maintaining her professional demeanor while subtly positioning herself to block his potential return to the gate area. Nearby, a United Airlines supervisor had approached and was speaking quietly with Sergeant Martinez, likely providing additional information about Harrington's earlier claims regarding a verbal agreement with the mythical Greg. Harrington noticed the conversation and immediately attempted to redirect his live stream toward the airline supervisor. "That's the corporate agent who's conspiring to deny my right to travel," he declared, moving suddenly toward the United employee. Mendoza smoothly intercepted his path, her movement fluid but decisive as she stepped between Harrington and her colleague. "Sir, please remain where you are," Mendoza directed, her tone firmer now as Harrington's behavior became more erratic. The change in her stance was subtle but unmistakable, her training in both law enforcement and Air Force security protocols evident in her positioning and readiness. "You need to lower your voice and stop creating a disturbance in the terminal," she added, establishing clear boundaries for acceptable behavior. Harrington's eyes darted between Mendoza, the United supervisor, and Sergeant Martinez, seeming to calculate his options as the situation evolved. "I'm not creating a disturbance, I'm documenting corporate tyranny," he insisted, though his voice had instinctively lowered somewhat. The clipboard in his hand was now clutched more tightly, his knuckles whitening around its metal edge. "We've contacted the customer service office, and they have no record of any employee named Greg working at the check-in counters this morning," the United supervisor stated, addressing Mendoza rather than Harrington directly. The information confirmed what Mendoza had already suspected. Harrington's claim of a verbal agreement was entirely fabricated, likely part of his sovereign citizen performance script. Harrington immediately interjected, his voice rising again despite his earlier moderation. "Greg works in a department not listed in your corporate structure," he claimed, the absurdity of his statement apparently lost on him. His free hand gestured emphatically as he continued to create an increasingly elaborate fiction. "He's part of the United Airlines Constitutional Compliance Division that honors Article 4 free inhabitant status," he added, the fabrication becoming more complex as he attempted to maintain his narrative. Officer Mendoza exchanged a brief glance with Sergeant Martinez, who gave an almost imperceptible nod, authorizing her continued handling of the situation. "Mr. Harrington, no such department exists," she stated plainly, addressing the falsehood directly rather than allowing it to stand unchallenged. Her straightforward approach seemed to momentarily fluster Harrington, who had clearly expected his claim to create more confusion. "You wouldn't know about it because it's not part of the public-facing corporate structure," Harrington countered, doubling down on his fabrication despite its obvious implausibility. His audience continued to grow, both in person as curious travelers slowed their pace to observe the confrontation, and online where his live stream view count had now exceeded 5,000. "My viewers know the truth about these hidden constitutional divisions within major corporations," he added, gesturing with his phone. The United supervisor, a woman in her 50s with the composed demeanor of someone who had handled countless unusual situations during her airline career, addressed Mendoza again. "Officer, we've checked the security footage from this morning, and Mr. Harrington did speak briefly with a customer service representative named Miguel, not Greg, who clearly informed him that his screenshot from 2018 was not a valid ticket for today's flight," she explained, providing concrete evidence that contradicted Harrington's narrative. Harrington's face flushed deeper at this revelation, though he quickly attempted to incorporate it into his performance. "Miguel is Greg's corporate strawman name," he declared, the absurdity of the statement hanging in the air for a moment before he continued. "Under Admiralty law, which governs all air travel, verbal contracts supersede your digital systems," he added, pivoting away from the easily disproven claim about the employee's identity. "Sir, Miguel explained to you this morning that you needed to purchase an actual ticket if you wanted to fly today," the supervisor continued, her tone professional but firm as she addressed Harrington directly for the first time. Her years of experience dealing with difficult customers was evident in her composed demeanor despite Harrington's increasingly bizarre claims. "He directed you to the ticketing counter, which you apparently chose not to visit," she added, filling in more details of what had actually transpired. The gathered crowd had grown large enough to begin impeding the flow of other travelers through the concourse, creating exactly the kind of disruption that airport operations sought to avoid. "We need to move this conversation away from this high-traffic area," Sergeant Martinez stated, stepping forward to take a more active role in managing the situation. His presence alone seemed to give Harrington pause, the sovereign citizen advocate momentarily quieting as he assessed the changing dynamic. "I do not consent to being moved against my will," Harrington declared, though his declaration lacked the confidence of his earlier pronouncements. His live stream audience continued to offer suggestions and encouragement, one comment advising him to ask if you're being detained or if you're free to go, a common phrase in sovereign citizen encounters with law enforcement. Seizing on this prompt from his viewers, Harrington squared his shoulders and addressed Mendoza directly. "Am I being detained or am I free to go?" he asked, clearly believing the question posed some kind of legal dilemma for the officer. The question, standard in sovereign citizen scripts, was meant to force authorities into either releasing the individual or formally detaining them, which they believed created some kind of legal advantage. "At this moment, you're not being detained," Officer Mendoza replied calmly, recognizing the script Harrington was following and refusing to be manipulated by it. Her response was technically accurate. He was not currently under arrest or formal detention, though his behavior was certainly being monitored. "However, you need to move away from this high-traffic area and lower your voice, or you will be subject to detention for creating a disturbance," she added, making the conditional nature of his freedom explicitly clear. Harrington's expression flickered with momentary confusion, as if the script in his head had not prepared him for this particular response. "Then I'm free to go anywhere in this public accommodation," he declared, attempting to reassert control of the interaction. His phone remained held high, capturing every moment for his audience, which had now grown to nearly 6,000 viewers according to the counter visible on his screen. "You're free to move about public areas of the airport, but not back to the secure gate area without a valid boarding pass," Sergeant Martinez interjected, his tone firm but professional. The clarification was necessary given Harrington's demonstrated tendency to interpret any statement in the most self-serving way possible. "And you must comply with all airport regulations, including those regarding disruptive behavior," he added, establishing clear boundaries. Harrington turned his attention and camera to Martinez, seemingly pleased to have a new authority figure to challenge. "And you are?" he demanded, adopting a tone that suggested he believed he had the right to interrogate law enforcement officers. His clipboard was now clutched against his chest, the papers it contained apparently forgotten in his excitement over confronting a second officer. Sergeant Carlos Martinez Denver Police Department Airport Unit, Martinez replied succinctly, his decades of experience evident in his calm, matter-of-fact delivery. Unlike Mendoza, who had engaged with Harrington's questions to de-escalate, Martinez's approach was more direct and less accommodating of Harrington's performance. "Now please move away from this area and lower your voice," he instructed, his tone leaving little room for argument. Rather than complying, Harrington seemed energized by the new confrontation. "I need your badge number and your bond number, Sergeant," he demanded, falling back on sovereign citizen terminology that held no actual legal significance. His voice had risen again, drawing even more attention from passers-by, and creating exactly the kind of spectacle that airport security protocols were designed to prevent. Martinez's expression remained impassive, his training and experience allowing him to recognize the provocation for what it was. "Badge number 2857, he stated simply, providing his official identification while ignoring the nonsensical request for a bond number. Behind him, 2 additional airport police officers had arrived and were now positioned strategically nearby, visible but not directly engaging with the situation. Harrington noticed the additional officers and immediately incorporated their presence into his narrative for his viewers. "They're bringing in reinforcements to suppress my constitutional rights, patriots," he declared, panning his phone camera to capture the growing police presence. The theatrical nature of his performance was becoming increasingly obvious, with each development in the situation immediately reframed to support his persecution narrative. Officer Mendoza used the moment to quietly confer with the United Airlines supervisor, confirming additional details about Harrington's earlier interactions at the airport. "He also tried this at the security checkpoint," the supervisor informed her in a low voice. "TSA has footage of him arguing about not needing ID because he's a free inhabitant," she added, providing context that suggested this was not an isolated incident but part of a planned series of confrontations. This information shifted Mendoza's assessment of the situation. Harrington wasn't simply a confused passenger, but someone deliberately creating multiple disturbances throughout the airport, possibly to generate content for his social media channels. "Mr. Harrington, we've received reports that you've been causing disturbances in several areas of the airport today," she stated, addressing him directly while Sergeant Martinez maintained his authoritative presence nearby. Harrington's eyes widened slightly at the revelation that his earlier activities had been noted and reported. "Exercising my rights is not causing a disturbance," he countered, though there was a new note of defensiveness in his tone. The clipboard he carried was now positioned almost like a shield between himself and the officers, as if the papers it contained might somehow protect him from the consequences of his actions. "We have video evidence of you arguing with TSA agents, making false claims about verbal contracts with airline staff, and now disrupting operations at the gate," Mendoza continued, laying out the pattern of behavior that had led to the current situation. Her tone remained professional, but carried a new firmness that signaled the end of the purely conversational approach. "This isn't about your beliefs or claims. This is about behavior that violates airport regulations and potentially federal law," she added, reframing the issue away from his sovereign citizen narrative. The mention of federal law seemed to give Harrington momentary pause, though he quickly recovered. "I do not recognize the jurisdiction of federal corporate statutes over my natural person," he declared, reaching into his clipboard to extract a document that appeared to be a homemade legal notice covered in unofficial stamps and seals. "I have here a notice of status and immunity that clearly establishes my standing under natural law," he added, attempting to hand the document to Mendoza. "I'm not accepting service of documents," Mendoza stated firmly, keeping her hands at her sides and refusing to take the paper. The refusal seemed to frustrate Harrington, who had clearly expected the document to create some kind of effect or reaction from the officers. "Sir, Your paperwork has no legal standing, regardless of how many stamps or seals you've added to it, she continued, addressing the fundamental misconception that underlay much of sovereign citizen ideology. Harrington's face flushed deeper at the dismissal of his carefully prepared document. "This is an official notice prepared under the authority of common law," he insisted, his voice rising again as his frustration mounted. The paper remained extended toward Mendoza, trembling slightly in his outstretched hand. "By refusing to accept it, you are in dishonor and default," he added, using terminology common in sovereign citizen pseudo-legal frameworks. "Mr. Harrington, creating your own documents doesn't make them legally binding," Sergeant Martinez interjected, his tone matter-of-fact rather than confrontational. The straightforward statement seemed to pierce Harrington's rhetorical armor more effectively than Mendoza's earlier attempts at reasoned engagement. "Now, this is your final warning to lower your voice and move away from this area," Martinez added, making it clear that the time for debate had ended. For a moment it seemed that Harrington might comply, as he lowered the document and took a half-step backward. "I'm moving under protest and duress," he declared, apparently selecting a phrase he believed would preserve some imagined legal position. His retreat, however, was immediately followed by a new tactic as he raised his voice to address the gathered crowd directly. "Everyone witnessing this needs to know that these officers are violating the Constitution," he announced, spinning to face the onlookers while continuing to record with his phone. The sudden shift in his attention created an opportunity for the officers to exchange quick glances, silently communicating their assessment of the escalating situation. "They're enforcing corporate policy over natural law," Harrington continued, his performance now explicitly directed at the crowd rather than the officers. Several travelers had indeed stopped to observe the unusual scene, many with phones raised to capture video of their own. "Sir, you're now creating a greater disturbance," Mendoza stated, stepping forward to reclaim Harrington's attention. Her movement was calculated to interrupt his appeal to the crowd while maintaining a professional distance. "If you don't comply immediately, you will be detained," she added, making the consequence of continued defiance explicit. Harrington spun back to face her, his expression a mixture of indignation and calculation. "Are you threatening me for exercising my First Amendment rights?" he demanded, positioning his phone to capture her response. The live stream comment count had continued to grow, with many viewers now actively encouraging him to escalate the situation further, suggestions ranging from "make them arrest you on camera" to demand a citizen's arrest of the officers. "I'm informing you of the consequences of continuing to create a disturbance in the airport," Mendoza replied, her tone level, despite Harrington's attempt to provoke an emotional response. Behind him, Sergeant Martinez had subtly signaled to the additional officers who were now positioning themselves for potential intervention if Harrington's behavior continued to escalate. Rather than heeding the warning, Harrington seemed to interpret it as an opportunity to martyrize himself for his online audience. "Patriots, they're threatening to kidnap me for speaking the truth," he declared, addressing his viewers directly while ignoring the increasingly serious situation developing around him. His performance had taken on a quality of deliberate provocation, as if he was actively seeking arrest to create more dramatic content for his channel. Officer Mendoza recognized the shift in his strategy and adjusted her approach accordingly. "Mr. Harrington, I need to see your identification now," she stated firmly, making a direct request that would require either compliance or explicit refusal. The tactical change moved the interaction from conversation to enforcement, establishing a clear line that would determine the next phase of the encounter. "I am not required to identify myself to corporate enforcement agents," Harrington replied immediately, the response clearly rehearsed and ready. His refusal to provide identification, while presented as a principled stand, constituted a direct failure to comply with a lawful order from law enforcement, a choice that carried legal consequences regardless of his sovereign citizen beliefs. Sergeant Martinez stepped forward, his presence reinforcing the seriousness of the situation. Failure to identify yourself to law enforcement officers, when legally required to do so, is a violation of Colorado Revised Statute 16.3.103, he stated, citing the specific law that Harrington was violating. The citation of the actual statute, rather than engagement with Harrington's pseudo-legal terminology, shifted the interaction firmly into the realm of law enforcement rather than debate. Harrington's expression flickered with uncertainty for the first time, as if suddenly recognizing that his performance might have real-world consequences beyond the content it generated for his channel. "I'm not driving a commercial vehicle, so I'm not required to present identification," he argued, though his voice lacked the confidence of his earlier declarations. The sovereign citizen argument, based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the distinction between driving privileges and identification requirements, revealed the fragility of his legal position. "This is not a traffic stop, Mr. Harrington," Mendoza explained, her tone professional but firm. "This is an investigative detention based on your disruptive behavior in a secure facility, and you are legally required to identify yourself," she continued, making the legal basis for the request explicit. The clarification left no room for Harrington's typical sovereign citizen evasions regarding traveling versus driving or commercial activity. For a moment, Harrington seemed to waver, glancing from his phone to the officers and back again, as if seeking guidance from his online audience. "My viewers are advising me to stand my ground," he stated, attempting to use his live stream as some form of collective authority. The comments were indeed scrolling rapidly, though with mixed messages ranging from encouragement to continue resisting to warnings that he was crossing a legal line. "Your viewers are not present and are not legally responsible for the consequences of your actions," Sergeant Martinez stated bluntly, cutting through Harrington's attempt to deflect responsibility. The straightforward response seemed to momentarily silence Harrington, who clearly hadn't anticipated this direct challenge to his performance framework. "You have one more opportunity to provide identification voluntarily," Martinez added, his tone making it clear that this was indeed the final request before more serious measures would be taken. Harrington's gaze darted between the officers, the gathered crowd, and his phone screen, where comments continued to scroll. "I'll show you my diplomatic identification," he finally offered, reaching into his jacket pocket with his free hand. The compromise, such as it was, revealed his awareness that the situation had progressed beyond his control, though he was still attempting to maintain his sovereign citizen narrative. From his pocket, Harrington produced the same homemade identification card he had shown earlier, featuring his photograph against a background of constitutional text. "This is my sovereign identification as a free inhabitant under the Articles of Confederation," he declared, holding the card toward the officers with the ceremonial gravity of someone presenting diplomatic credentials. The laminated document, clearly self-produced, bore no official government seals or security features that would mark legitimate identification. Officer Mendoza studied the card without taking it from Harrington's hand. "This is not government-issued identification," she stated matter-of-factly, addressing the obvious reality rather than engaging with Harrington's claims about its significance. Her refusal to accept the homemade card as legitimate identification further narrowed Harrington's options, pushing the situation closer to the point where physical detention would become necessary. "It supersedes government identification because it predates the corporate United States," Harrington insisted, his voice rising again as his frustration mounted. His belief in the magical properties of his self-created documents was evident in his expression, a mixture of genuine conviction and performative indignation for his audience. "By natural law, this identification is superior to any corporate-issued document," he added, seemingly reciting from sovereign citizen literature. Sergeant Martinez exchanged a brief glance with Mendoza, a silent communication between experienced officers who recognized that the time for conversation had ended. "Mr. Harrington, do you have a government-issued ID such as a driver's license, passport, or state identification card?" Martinez asked directly, giving one final opportunity for compliance before escalation became unavoidable. Harrington's hesitation revealed that he did indeed possess standard identification, but was choosing to withhold it as part of his sovereign citizen performance. "I have a driver's license, but I do not consent to presenting it," he finally admitted, the statement confirming what the officers had already suspected. His deliberate noncompliance, now explicitly acknowledged, crossed the line from ideological protest to active obstruction of law enforcement. "Then you leave us no choice," Martinez stated, his tone reflecting the regrettable but necessary progression of the encounter. He nodded to Officer Mendoza, a subtle signal that authorized the next step in their response. "Mitchell Harrington, you are being detained for failure to provide identification and creating a disturbance in a secure facility," Mendoza announced formally, establishing the legal basis for the detention that was about to occur. Harrington's eyes widened at the formal declaration, though it could hardly have come as a surprise given the trajectory of the interaction. "I do not consent to detainment or arrest," he declared, taking a step backward while continuing to hold his phone high to record the encounter. The statement, another standard element of sovereign citizen scripts, reflected the fundamental misconception that law enforcement actions required consent from the subject. "Your consent is not required for a lawful detention," Officer Mendoza explained calmly as she stepped forward, maintaining control of the interaction while Sergeant Martinez positioned himself to provide immediate support if needed. The additional officers nearby had also begun to move closer, creating a controlled perimeter around the unfolding situation to protect both the officers and bystanders. Sensing the impending detention, Harrington's performance reached a new level of theatricality. "I'm being kidnapped by corporate agents," he shouted toward his phone, ensuring his live stream audience captured his version of events. His free hand clutched his clipboard more tightly, while his other arm extended the phone as far as possible to continue recording despite the officer's approach. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," Mendoza instructed clearly, her training evident in her composed demeanor despite Harrington's escalating behavior. The command was standard procedure for ensuring officer safety during a detention, particularly when the subject had demonstrated unpredictable and non-compliant behavior. Instead of complying, Harrington took another step backward, nearly bumping into a family with luggage who had been watching the confrontation. "I do not consent," he repeated loudly, his voice echoing in the concourse as he continued to resist the lawful commands. The family quickly moved away, their expressions a mixture of alarm and annoyance at being drawn into the unfolding scene. Officer Mendoza moved forward smoothly, her approach measured but determined as she closed the distance between herself and Harrington. "Sir, physical resistance will result in additional charges," she warned, giving him one final opportunity to comply voluntarily with the detention. Behind her, Sergeant Martinez had positioned himself to intervene immediately if Harrington's resistance escalated to physical confrontation. For a moment, it seemed Harrington might recognize the futility of resistance and submit to the detention as his posture shifted slightly and his expression faltered. "I'm complying under protest and duress," he declared, using the phrase he seemed to believe provided some legal protection. The declaration, however, was not accompanied by the physical compliance the officers had instructed. He neither turned around nor placed his hands behind his back as directed. "Turn around now," Mendoza repeated more firmly, her patience evident but clearly reaching its limit after nearly 30 minutes of Harrington's evasion and noncompliance. The gathered crowd had grown larger, with dozens of travelers now watching the confrontation unfold, many recording with their phones in a mirror of Harrington's own documentation efforts. Rather than comply, Harrington made a sudden move that changed the dynamic entirely. He took a quick step to the side, as if attempting to move around Officer Mendoza toward the gate area from which he had originally been removed. The movement was not quite an assault, but certainly constituted active physical resistance to lawful detention, crossing the line from verbal non-compliance to physical evasion. Officer Mendoza reacted with the practiced speed of her extensive training, smoothly intercepting Harrington's movement and taking control of his arm in a standard compliance hold. "Stop resisting," she instructed clearly, her voice remaining professional despite the escalation. The hold was applied with precisely calibrated force, sufficient to establish control without causing injury, the result of countless training hours in the proper application of restraint techniques. "This is assault," Harrington shouted, his free arm still holding his phone high, despite Mendoza's grip on his other arm. His declaration was clearly for his audience, rather than an accurate description of the controlled restraint technique being applied. "I'm being assaulted for exercising my rights," he continued, his voice rising to a near scream as he attempted to twist away from Mendoza's hold. Sergeant Martinez moved in immediately to assist, securing Harrington's other arm and causing him to drop his phone in the process. "Stop resisting and put your hands behind your back," Martinez instructed firmly, his experienced hands applying a complementary control technique that worked in concert with Mendoza's hold. The coordination between the officers reflected their professional training and partnership. The phone clattered to the floor but continued recording, now capturing the scene from a low angle that dramatized the officers' positions. "My property," Harrington protested, attempting to look down at the phone as the officers maintained their control holds. His concern for the recording device seemed to outweigh his physical resistance momentarily, allowing the officers to secure his arms behind his back. "You are being detained, not arrested at this time," Mendoza explained clearly, as she applied handcuffs with practiced efficiency. The distinction was important both legally and procedurally. A detention for investigation was a temporary measure that could potentially resolve without formal arrest, depending on Harrington's subsequent cooperation and the results of their investigation. With Harrington secured in handcuffs, Sergeant Martinez carefully retrieved the phone from the floor, noting that it was still actively live streaming. "Your property will be secured and returned to you," he stated, making it clear that the device was being temporarily held as part of standard procedure rather than permanently confiscated. The transparency was important, both for Harrington's benefit and for the record being created by the multiple cameras documenting the encounter. "You have no right to take my property," Harrington protested, though his resistance had become primarily verbal now that he was physically secured. His earlier bravado had diminished considerably once the handcuffs were applied, revealing the gap between his sovereign citizen theories and the reality of law enforcement procedure. "That's an unlawful seizure under the Fourth Amendment," he added, ironically invoking the very Constitution he had earlier claimed was invalidated by corporate corruption. Officer Mendoza maintained her professional demeanor despite Harrington's continued protests. "Your phone and other property will be inventoried and secured according to department policy," she explained calmly, making the standard procedure explicit. The live stream was still active on the phone screen, comments scrolling rapidly as viewers reacted to the detention they were witnessing in real time. "My audience has witnessed this entire unlawful detention," Harrington declared, apparently finding some comfort in the knowledge that his performance had been documented for his followers. The statement revealed much about his priorities. The creation of content for his channel seemed at least as important to him as any genuine belief in sovereign citizen ideology. Sergeant Martinez handed the phone to one of the assisting officers, instructing them to end the live stream and secure the device according to protocol. "Sir, we're going to escort you to the airport police office now," he informed Harrington, his tone professional but firm. The decision to move Harrington away from the public area was both procedural and practical. Continuing the interaction in the busy concourse would only create further disruption. "I do not consent to being moved," Harrington stated reflexively, though the declaration was purely symbolic now that he was physically detained and secured in handcuffs. His continued invocation of sovereign citizen phrases seemed increasingly disconnected from the reality of his situation, as if he was reading from a script that had failed to prepare him for the actual consequences of his actions. "Your consent is not required," Mendoza reminded him simply, as she and Martinez began to escort him toward the police office located within the terminal. The movement was controlled and deliberate, with Harrington positioned between the two officers in standard escort formation. "Please walk forward," she added, giving a clear instruction that left no room for misinterpretation. As they proceeded through the concourse, Harrington continued his verbal protests, though at a somewhat lower volume than before. "This is kidnapping under color of law," he declared to anyone within earshot, his sovereign citizen script apparently containing phrases for every stage of the encounter. His resistance had become purely verbal, however, as he seemed to recognize the futility of physical noncompliance while secured in handcuffs between two trained officers. The spectacle drew curious glances from travelers passing through the busy terminal, many slowing their pace to observe the unusual sight of a man in business attire being escorted in handcuffs. "Keep moving, sir," Sergeant Martinez instructed firmly whenever Harrington attempted to slow their progress to address onlookers. The professional efficiency of the officers prevented Harrington from turning the escort into another performance for an audience. "These officers are violating my rights as a free inhabitant," Harrington called out to a group of passengers waiting at a nearby gate, his voice carrying despite his reduced volume. The passengers looked up briefly from their devices, but most quickly returned to their previous activities, apparently recognizing the situation as one of law enforcement handling a disruptive individual rather than any kind of injustice requiring intervention. Officer Mendoza maintained her composed demeanor throughout the escort, neither engaging with Harrington's continued rhetoric nor allowing it to affect the professional execution of her duties. "We're almost to the office, sir," she stated matter-of-factly, as they approached a door marked Airport Police in a less trafficked area of the terminal. The comment was both informative and a subtle reminder that the public phase of their interaction was coming to an end. Harrington seemed to recognize this transition as well, his protests becoming more urgent as they neared the police office. "My audience needs to know where you're taking me," he insisted, apparently concerned that the documentation of his encounter would end once he was removed from public view. His priority remained the narrative he was creating for his followers, even as the legal consequences of his actions became increasingly real. "You're being taken to the Denver Police Department Airport Unit office for further investigation," Martinez explained clearly, ensuring that both Harrington and any observers understood the legitimate and transparent nature of their actions. The officer's commitment to procedural clarity reflected both his professional training and awareness of the scrutiny that law enforcement encounters often received, particularly those involving individuals who deliberately sought to create contentious interactions. As they reached the door to the police office, Harrington made one final appeal to passers-by. "Remember my name, Mitchell Harrington, political prisoner," he called out, his voice rising again as he attempted to frame his detention as political persecution rather than the consequence of his disruptive behavior. The declaration echoed in the corridor, but generated little response from the few travelers in the area, who seemed more interested in continuing to their destinations than engaging with what was clearly a law enforcement matter. Once inside the office, the environment shifted dramatically from the open, public concourse to the controlled, professional space of the police facility. "Please have a seat," Mendoza directed, indicating a chair positioned near a desk in the processing area. The office was standard law enforcement. Designed, functional, orderly, and equipped with cameras that recorded all interactions for both officer safety and the protection of detained individuals. Harrington hesitated briefly before complying with the instruction to sit, his eyes scanning the office as if searching for new angles of resistance now that his audience was gone. "I do not consent to this jurisdiction," he stated, though he nevertheless lowered himself into the indicated chair. His continued invocation of sovereign citizen phrases had taken on an almost ritualistic quality, as if the words themselves might somehow alter his circumstances despite their lack of legal meaning. "Mr. Harrington, I'm going to remove one handcuff so you can provide your identification," Officer Mendoza explained, proceeding to release his right hand while maintaining the security of the left handcuff. The procedural accommodation was standard, allowing the detained individuals sufficient freedom of movement to access identification while maintaining necessary security controls. "Please produce your government-issued ID now," she added, her tone making it clear that further resistance would only complicate his situation. With his right hand freed, Harrington hesitated, clearly weighing his options in this new environment. "If I show identification, I'm not waiving any of my rights under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or natural law," he stated, apparently attempting to create some form of verbal reservation that he believed would preserve his sovereign citizen status despite complying with the identification request. "Your statement is noted," Sergeant Martinez replied simply, neither confirming nor denying the legal validity of Harrington's declaration. The tactical acknowledgment avoided unnecessary debate while allowing Harrington to feel he had established his position for the record. "Please provide your ID now," Martinez continued, refocusing on the practical matter at hand rather than engaging with sovereign citizen theory. After another moment of hesitation, Harrington finally reached into his back pocket and produced a Colorado driver's license, which he handed to Officer Mendoza with visible reluctance. "This is issued to my strawman entity, not my natural person," he clarified, continuing his sovereign citizen narrative despite the act of compliance. The distinction he attempted to draw between his strawman legal identity and his natural person was a common element of sovereign citizen mythology that had no basis in actual law. Officer Mendoza accepted the license without comment on Harrington's statement, examining it briefly to confirm it was indeed a valid, government-issued identification. "Mitchell Edward Harrington, 1976, 3-15, she read aloud, confirming the basic information for the record as Sergeant Martinez documented the details in the incident report he had begun preparing. The license, despite Harrington's claims about its limited applicability to his strawman, provided all the standard identifying information required for law enforcement purposes. "I need to advise you of your rights, Mr. Harrington," Mendoza stated, transitioning to the next procedural step now that Harrington's identity had been officially established. The Miranda warning was a standard precaution at this stage, ensuring that any statements Harrington made during questioning would be admissible if the detention progressed to formal arrest and criminal charges. "You have the right to remain silent," she began, proceeding through the familiar advisement that had become embedded in American law enforcement procedure since the 1966 Supreme Court decision. Harrington interrupted before she could complete the warning. "I do not recognize these corporate Miranda rights," he declared, raising his free hand as if to physically stop her words. His interruption reflected another common sovereign citizen belief, that standard legal procedures could be rejected through verbal declarations of non-consent, a notion that had no basis in actual jurisprudence. "I reserve all rights under UCC 1-308, he added, citing a section of the Uniform Commercial Code that sovereign citizens often misinterpreted as providing some form of legal immunity. "Nevertheless, I am required to advise you of these rights," Mendoza continued calmly, proceeding with the warning despite Harrington's objection. Her professional obligation to complete the advisement superseded his personal beliefs about its applicability, ensuring that proper procedure was followed regardless of his sovereign citizen ideology. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law," she continued, methodically completing the standard warning. Once the Miranda advisement was completed, Sergeant Martinez approached with several forms on a clipboard. "We need to inventory the personal property you had with you at the time of detention," he explained, placing the clipboard on the desk near Harrington. The inventory was another standard procedure, ensuring that all items taken from a detained individual were properly documented and secured. Harrington's expression darkened at the mention of his property. "Where is my phone?" he demanded, clearly concerned about the device that had been live-streaming his confrontation with the officers. The sudden shift in his focus revealed his priorities. The documentation of his encounter for his audience appeared more important to him than the legal consequences he was facing. "Your phone has been secured and will be listed on the inventory," Officer Mendoza explained, indicating the form on the clipboard where all personal items would be documented. The phone, like all property taken during a detention, would be carefully logged and secured according to department policy to maintain chain of custody and protect both the department and the detained individual from claims of theft or damage. "I demand my phone be returned immediately," Harrington insisted, his tone more urgent than it had been even during his detention in the concourse. The request revealed the central importance of the recording device to his sovereign citizen performance. Without it, he lost both his audience and his ability to control the narrative of the encounter. "It contains evidence of your violations of my rights," he added, attempting to frame the request as a matter of preserving evidence rather than maintaining his social media presence. Sergeant Martinez remained unmoved by the demand. "All personal property will be secured during processing and either returned to you upon release or logged into evidence if relevant to potential charges," he explained, following standard department procedure for handling detained individuals' property. The protocol was designed to protect both the integrity of potential evidence and the personal property of those in custody. Harrington's free hand clenched into a fist as his frustration mounted. "What exactly am I being charged with?" he demanded, the question reflecting a shift in his approach from sovereign citizen rhetoric to more conventional legal concerns. The transition suggested that the reality of his situation was beginning to penetrate the ideological framework that had guided his earlier behavior. "At this time, you're being detained for investigation of several possible violations," Mendoza explained, maintaining her professional demeanor, despite Harrington's evident frustration. She consulted her notes before continuing, ensuring accuracy in her statement. "These include causing a disturbance in an airport facility, failure to comply with lawful orders from law enforcement, attempting to access a secure area without authorization, and resisting detention," she listed, making the potential charges explicit so that Harrington would understand the seriousness of his situation. The enumeration of potential charges seemed to give Harrington pause, as if he was finally recognizing the gap between sovereign citizen theory and the actual legal consequences he was facing. "Those are all corporate statutes that don't apply to me as a free inhabitant," he stated, though his declaration lacked the confidence of his earlier pronouncements in the concourse. The controlled environment of the police office, removed from his online audience, appeared to diminish the performance aspect of his sovereign citizen identity. Mr. Harrington, the Colorado Revised Statutes and Denver Municipal Code apply to all persons within their respective jurisdictions, regardless of personal beliefs about legal theories, Sergeant Martinez stated matter-of-factly, addressing the fundamental misconception at the heart of sovereign citizen ideology. His tone was not confrontational, but simply informative, as if explaining a basic fact rather than engaging in debate. Harrington's expression flickered with uncertainty, the reality of his situation apparently beginning to penetrate his ideological armor. "I want to speak to an attorney," he stated after a moment of silence, the declaration marking a significant shift from his earlier sovereign citizen script. The request for legal counsel, a right explicitly mentioned in the Miranda warning he had attempted to reject, suggested a growing recognition of the actual legal framework within which his case would be processed. "That is your right," Officer Mendoza acknowledged immediately, making note of the request in her documentation of the encounter. The right to counsel was fundamental to the justice system, and Harrington's invocation of it would affect how the officers proceeded with questioning. "We'll provide you with access to a phone to contact an attorney once we complete processing," she added, explaining the practical next steps. Harrington nodded slightly, his demeanor noticeably subdued compared to his theatrical performance in the terminal. "My satchel contains legal documents that I need," he stated, gesturing toward the bag that had been taken from him during the detention. The request was more conventional than his earlier demands, suggesting a transition from sovereign citizen performance to practical concerns about his immediate situation. "We'll inventory all items in your possession, including your bag, and make note of any legal documents," Sergeant Martinez assured him, maintaining the professional procedural approach that characterized the officers' handling of the situation. The inventory process was designed to be transparent and thorough, protecting both the department and the detained individual from potential disputes about property. As Officer Mendoza began the inventory process, opening Harrington's satchel on the desk, the contents revealed much about his preparation for the airport confrontation. "For the record, the bag contains a metal clipboard with multiple printed documents," she noted, speaking clearly for the benefit of the recording system in the office. Each item was removed and placed on the desk in a neat arrangement, creating a visual inventory to complement the written documentation. The contents of Harrington's satchel painted a clear picture of his intentions upon arriving at the airport that morning. One folder labeled Legal Notices and Filings, containing multiple documents with unofficial stamps and seals, Mendoza continued, methodically documenting each item. The folder's contents were a collection of pseudo-legal paperwork typical of sovereign citizen preparation, homemade documents designed to mimic official legal filings but lacking any actual legal standing or effect. "Those are official documents filed under natural law jurisdiction," Harrington interjected, his sovereign citizen persona reasserting itself as he watched his carefully prepared materials being catalogued as evidence. His free hand reached toward the documents instinctively, though he stopped short of actually attempting to take them from the desk. "They establish my status as a free inhabitant exempt from corporate statutes," he added, his tone suggesting genuine belief in the efficacy of the papers despite their obvious lack of official status. Officer Mendoza continued the inventory, without directly engaging with Harrington's claims about the documents. One printout of Wikipedia pages regarding maritime law, highlighted in yellow with handwritten notes in the margins, she noted, placing the pages alongside the other items on the desk. The printout, approximately 15 pages in length, contained sections on admiralty jurisdiction, the law of the sea, and historical maritime regulations, all topics frequently misappropriated by sovereign citizen ideology to construct elaborate but legally meaningless theories about jurisdiction and authority. One partial Subway sandwich, turkey on wheat, wrapped in paper, Mendoza continued, her professional demeanor not wavering despite the incongruity of the item among the pseudo-legal documents. The half-eaten sandwich, perhaps purchased during Harrington's extended stay at the airport that morning, was placed in a separate evidence bag to prevent contamination of the paper documents. One smartphone, iPhone model, currently powered on, she added, placing the device that had been live-streaming the confrontation on the desk alongside the other items. Harrington's attention fixed immediately on the phone. That device contains evidence of this entire interaction, he stated, his concern for the recording evident in his tone. The phone represented both his connection to his online audience and his documentation of the encounter, dual purposes that appeared central to his sovereign citizen performance. I do not consent to it being searched without a warrant, he added, apparently aware enough of actual legal principles to invoke Fourth Amendment protections regarding electronic devices. Your non-consent to search is noted, Sergeant Martinez acknowledged, making an entry in his report to document Harrington's statement. The procedural acknowledgement was important. While the phone could be inventoried as personal property, accessing its contents without consent would indeed require additional legal steps, such as a warrant, regardless of Harrington's sovereign citizen beliefs about other aspects of law enforcement authority. As the inventory continued, Officer Mendoza uncovered additional items that further illustrated Harrington's preparation for his airport confrontation. One book titled Sovereign Strategies, Reclaiming Your Natural Rights. Author Mitchell E. Harrington, she noted, holding up a self-published volume that appeared to be Harrington's own work on sovereign citizen theory. The book's cover featured a stylized image of an eagle breaking free from chains, with subtitled text promising to reveal hidden legal secrets the government doesn't want you to know. Harrington straightened slightly at the sight of his book, a hint of pride, momentarily displacing his frustration. That's my most recent publication, he confirmed, apparently viewing the work as a credential that lent legitimacy to his sovereign citizen claims. The book's presence in his satchel suggested he might have planned to reference it during his confrontation with airport authorities, perhaps even to promote it to his live-stream audience as part of his performance. One business card holder containing cards identifying Mitchell Harrington as constitutional strategist and sovereign rights educator, Mendoza continued, adding the cards to the growing arrangement of items on the desk. The cards, like the other materials, featured unofficial seals and ornate borders designed to mimic governmental or official documentation, though they had clearly been produced using standard consumer printing services. The final item from the satchel was perhaps the most revealing about Harrington's motivations for the airport confrontation. One notebook containing what appears to be a script or outline titled Airport Authority Challenge, Live Stream Action Plan, Mendoza noted, carefully placing the notebook open to the relevant page. The handwritten outline included bullet points for various scenarios, suggested phrases to use when confronted by airline staff or law enforcement, and notes about increasing viewer engagement through escalating confrontation. Harrington shifted uncomfortably in his seat as the notebook was added to the displayed items, its contents making explicit the premeditated and performative nature of his actions at the airport that morning. "That's my private property," he stated, his earlier insistence about the legal significance of his documents notably absent regarding this particularly damning item. The notebook effectively undermined any claim that his actions had been spontaneous responses to perceived injustice rather than a carefully planned performance designed to generate content for his social media channel. All items will be photographed, logged in the evidence system, and a receipt provided to you, Sergeant Martinez explained, maintaining the procedural focus that had characterized the officer's approach throughout the encounter. The evidence documentation was standard protocol, ensuring that all items were properly recorded both for potential prosecution and for the protection of Harrington's property rights during his detention. With the inventory complete, Officer Mendoza turned her attention back to Harrington himself. "Mr. Harrington, we need to discuss the events that occurred at Gate A4 this morning," she stated, transitioning to the investigative phase of the detention now that the procedural requirements of property documentation had been fulfilled. Despite Harrington's earlier request for an attorney, basic investigative questioning was still permissible to establish the facts of the incident. Harrington's demeanor had changed noticeably since his arrival at the police office, his theatrical sovereign citizen persona giving way to a more subdued and conventional demeanor as the reality of his situation became increasingly apparent. "I was exercising my rights to travel," he stated, though the declaration lacked the forceful certainty of his earlier pronouncements in the terminal. The controlled environment of the police office, combined with the methodical documentation of his actions, seemed to have diminished his confidence in the sovereign citizen script he had been following. "According to airline records and witness statements, you attempted to board United Airlines Flight 1624 to Chicago without a valid ticket," Mendoza stated, consulting her notes as she laid out the basic facts of the incident. The straightforward presentation of evidence contrasted sharply with Harrington's elaborate, sovereign citizen narratives, bringing the interaction back to the concrete reality of what had actually occurred at the gate. Harrington shifted in his seat, his free hand adjusting his navy blazer in what appeared to be a nervous gesture. "I had a verbal contract with a United representative," he insisted, though his voice lacked conviction as he repeated the claim that had already been disproven through the airline's records and security footage. The fiction about Greg and a verbal contract of carriage seemed increasingly hollow in the face of documented evidence to the contrary. United Airlines has no record of any such agreement, and their security footage shows you speaking briefly with a customer service representative named Miguel, who directed you to the ticketing counter after explaining that your 2018 screenshot was not a valid ticket, Sergeant Martinez stated, referring to information provided by the airline supervisor during their earlier conversation in the terminal. The specific details, the employee's actual name, the nature of the interaction, the direction to purchase a legitimate ticket, cut through Harrington's vague claims about verbal contracts and hidden constitutional divisions within the airline. For the first time since the beginning of the encounter, Harrington seemed genuinely at a loss for words, his sovereign citizen script failing to provide a response to such specific and verifiable contradictions of his narrative. Miguel wasn't authorized to speak for the entire corporate entity, he finally stated, though the argument sounded weak even to his own ears, judging by his uncertain tone. The gap between sovereign citizen theory and practical reality had become increasingly difficult for him to bridge as the evidence against him accumulated. "Mr. Harrington, according to your YouTube channel description, you identify as a First Amendment auditor who tests the boundaries of constitutional rights in public spaces," Officer Mendoza noted, introducing information about Harrington's online presence that provided context for his actions at the airport. The reference to his self-proclaimed role suggested that the officers had conducted basic research on his background during the initial stages of their investigation. The mention of his YouTube channel seemed to momentarily reinvigorate Harrington, providing a familiar framework within which to situate his actions. "I educate the public about their constitutional rights through practical demonstrations," he confirmed, his tone taking on a note of pride that had been absent during the inventory process. The description framed his disruptive behavior as a form of educational activism, rather than a deliberate attempt to create conflicts for online content. "Your channel features numerous videos of similar confrontations with authority figures, including TSA agents, police officers, and government employees," Martinez continued, making it clear that the officers were aware of Harrington's pattern of behavior beyond the immediate incident. The context was relevant both to establishing his intent during the airport confrontation and to assessing the appropriate response to his actions. Harrington straightened slightly in his chair, apparently viewing the discussion of his online activities as an opportunity to justify his behavior. "I document the systematic violation of constitutional rights by corporate government entities," he stated, his voice regaining some of the confidence he had displayed during his performance in the terminal. The sovereign citizen terminology had returned to his speech, suggesting that he was falling back on familiar rhetorical patterns when discussing his self-defined mission. Officer Mendoza maintained her professional focus, neither endorsing nor directly challenging Harrington's characterization of his activities. "Today's incident appears to follow a pattern documented in your previous videos and outlined in the notebook found in your possession," she observed, connecting his actions at the airport to the premeditated action plan discovered during the inventory of his satchel. The observation shifted the framing of the incident from spontaneous exercise of rights to deliberate provocation designed to create content. "I was simply attempting to board my flight," Harrington insisted, though the claim contradicted both the evidence of his actions and the documented plan found in his notebook. The disconnect between his stated intention and the reality of his behavior highlighted the fundamental dishonesty at the heart of his sovereign citizen performance. He had come to the airport not to travel, but to create a confrontation that would generate content for his channel. Your notebook explicitly outlines a plan to challenge gate agents by presenting invalid documentation and claiming verbal agreements that don't exist, Sergeant Martinez stated, referencing the contents of the Airport Authority Challenge outline that had been discovered during the inventory. The evidence of premeditation undermined any claim that Harrington had been genuinely attempting to exercise travel rights rather than deliberately creating a disruptive scenario. For the first time during the encounter, Harrington seemed genuinely uncomfortable rather than performatively indignant, his gaze dropping to avoid eye contact with the officers. "That's just a thought exercise," he claimed weakly, the explanation failing to account for how closely his actual behavior had followed the outline documented in the notebook. His sovereign citizen bravado had diminished considerably now that the performative nature of his actions had been exposed. "Mr. Harrington, your actions today created a significant disruption to airport operations," Officer Mendoza stated, shifting the focus from Harrington's motivations to the practical consequences of his behavior. The statement brought the discussion back to the concrete impacts that would form the basis for any potential charges, rather than the ideological framework Harrington had attempted to construct around his actions. Flight 1624 was delayed by approximately 17 minutes due to the disturbance you created at the gate, she continued, citing specific information provided by airline operations. The mention of actual operational impacts seemed to give Harrington pause, as if he had not considered the tangible consequences of his performance beyond its value as content for his channel. "That's the airline's choice to delay their flight," he countered, though his argument lacked the forceful certainty of his earlier declarations. The attempt to deflect responsibility revealed a key aspect of sovereign citizen psychology, the belief that one could engage in disruptive behavior without bearing responsibility for its consequences on others. "Your physical obstruction of the boarding lane and subsequent attempt to breach the jetway door directly caused the delay," Sergeant Martinez corrected, his tone matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. The straightforward attribution of cause and effect cut through Harrington's attempt to separate his actions from their obvious consequences. Additionally, airport operations had to deploy additional security personnel to manage the crowd that gathered during your confrontation with Officer Mendoza, he added, detailing further operational impacts beyond the flight delay. Harrington shifted in his seat, his free hand adjusting his blazer again in what had become a recognizable, nervous gesture. "I was exercising my First Amendment rights to free speech," he insisted, pivoting away from sovereign citizen terminology toward more conventional constitutional arguments. The shift in his rhetorical approach suggested an adaptive strategy. When one framework failed to provide protection, he simply switched to another that might offer some legal shield for his behavior. The First Amendment does not protect disruptive conduct in a secure facility, particularly when that conduct impedes the operations of a federally regulated transportation system, Officer Mendoza explained, addressing the constitutional claim directly rather than allowing it to stand unchallenged. Her response reflected both legal accuracy and practical reality. Constitutional rights had well-established limitations, particularly in sensitive environments like airports where security and operational efficiency were paramount concerns. For a moment, Harrington seemed to consider this information, his expression suggesting an internal calculation about his legal position. "What's going to happen now?" he finally asked, the question notable for its practicality compared to his earlier sovereign citizen declarations. The shift from ideological resistance to practical concerns about consequences suggested a growing recognition of the reality of his situation. "Based on our investigation, including witness statements, security footage, and the evidence recovered from your possession, we're preparing charges for submission to the district attorney," Sergeant Martinez explained, his tone professional rather than punitive, as he outlined the process. The procedural explanation maintained the officer's focus on transparent law enforcement rather than engaging with Harrington's sovereign citizen framework. Harrington's expression tightened at the mention of charges, the reality of potential legal consequences apparently becoming increasingly clear to him. "What specific charges?" he asked, his question direct and focused on practical legal matters rather than sovereign citizen theory. The shift in his approach suggested that the concrete reality of his situation was penetrating the ideological bubble that had guided his behavior during the airport confrontation. "At this time, we anticipate charging you with trespassing in a restricted area, disorderly conduct creating a disturbance in an airport facility, obstruction of government operations, and resisting a peace officer," Mendoza listed, consulting her notes to ensure accuracy in the potential charges. Each charge was tied directly to specific behaviors Harrington had exhibited during the incident, creating a clear connection between his actions and their legal consequences. The enumeration of potential charges seemed to have a sobering effect on Harrington, his posture slumping slightly as the seriousness of his situation became increasingly apparent. "Those are all misdemeanors, right?" he asked, his question revealing both a concern about potential penalties and a surprising familiarity with criminal classification that belied his earlier claims about being exempt from statutory law. The charges range from petty offenses to Class II misdemeanors under Colorado law, Sergeant Martinez confirmed, maintaining the factual, informative approach that characterized the officer's handling of the situation. The classification information was provided as a straightforward answer to Harrington's question, rather than as a threat or intimidation tactic. "The district attorney will make the final determination on which charges to file based on our report and the evidence collected," he added, clarifying the process by which the final charges would be determined. Harrington nodded slowly, his sovereign citizen performance having largely evaporated in the face of concrete legal information about his situation. "When will I be able to make a phone call?" he asked, his question reflecting practical concerns about his immediate circumstances rather than ideological declarations about jurisdiction or natural rights. The shift in focus suggested a significant transformation in his approach to the situation, from performative resistance to practical navigation of the legal system. We'll provide you with access to a phone once processing is complete, Officer Mendoza assured him, maintaining the professional, procedural approach that had characterized her handling of the situation from the beginning. The response addressed Harrington's practical concern while continuing to move the process forward according to standard department protocols. In the meantime, is there anything else you'd like to add to your statement about what occurred at Gate A4 this morning? She asked, providing a final opportunity for Harrington to offer his perspective on the incident. For a moment, Harrington seemed to consider returning to his sovereign citizen script, his expression flickering, as if mentally reviewing the phrases and declarations that had formed the core of his performance in the terminal. "I maintain that I was exercising my rights," he finally stated, though the declaration lacked the elaborate pseudo-legal framework that had characterized his earlier pronouncements. The simplified statement suggested a strategic retreat from the more extreme elements of sovereign citizen ideology in the face of actual legal consequences. "Your statement has been noted," Mendoza acknowledged, neither challenging nor endorsing Harrington's claim, but simply documenting it as part of the record. Her professional response maintained the procedural focus that had guided the officer's approach throughout the encounter, treating Harrington's statement as information to be recorded rather than as a challenge to be debated. With the initial investigation and documentation complete, the officers prepared to transfer Harrington to the central booking facility for further processing. "Mr. Harrington, you'll be transported to the Denver Sheriff's Department detention facility for booking," Sergeant Martinez explained, outlining the next step in the process. The transportation would move Harrington from the airport police office to the main detention center, where formal booking, fingerprinting, and arraignment would take place. Harrington's expression tightened at the mention of continued detention, the reality of his situation apparently becoming increasingly clear to him. "How long will that take?" he asked, his question focused on practical logistics rather than sovereign citizen declarations about jurisdiction or authority. The shift in his concerns reflected the gradual erosion of his ideological framework in the face of concrete legal processes. The transportation and booking process typically takes several hours, Officer Mendoza explained, providing a realistic time frame based on standard procedures. The transparent information allowed Harrington to understand what to expect during the next phase of his processing, maintaining the professional approach that had characterized the officer's handling of the situation. "Once booking is complete, you'll have an opportunity to post bond if the judge sets bail, or you'll be held until arraignment," she added, outlining the potential paths forward, depending on judicial decisions regarding his case. As the officers prepared the necessary paperwork for Harrington's transfer, their radio communications indicated that the transport vehicle had arrived at the designated secure entrance to the airport police facility. "The transport is here," Martinez noted, completing the final documentation required before Harrington could be moved to the main detention facility. The efficiency of the process reflected the well-established protocols for handling detained individuals within the airport law enforcement system. "Mr. Harrington, please stand up," Mendoza instructed, preparing to secure Harrington for transportation according to department policy. The standardized procedure ensured both officer safety and the secure transfer of detained individuals between facilities. "I'll need to secure both handcuffs before transport," she added, moving to reattach the second handcuff that had been removed during the identification and processing phase. Harrington complied with the instruction to stand, his earlier resistance noticeably absent, as the reality of his situation had become increasingly clear during the processing procedure. "Is this really necessary?" he asked, as Mendoza secured the second handcuff, his question reflecting discomfort with the physical restraint rather than ideological objection to the officer's authority. The shift in his concerns from sovereign citizen theory to practical comfort highlighted the transformation in his approach as the consequences of his actions became concrete rather than theoretical. Standard transport protocol requires secure restraints for all individuals in custody, Mendoza explained matter-of-factly, neither apologizing for the procedure nor using it as a punishment. The explanation reflected the procedural, non-personal nature of the security measures. They were applied consistently regardless of the individual's identity or the specific circumstances of their detention. As they prepared to exit the airport police office for the transport vehicle, Harrington made one final inquiry that revealed his ongoing concern about the documentation of his encounter. "What happens to my phone and the recording it contains?" he asked, his attention returning to the device that had been live-streaming his confrontation with the officers. The question highlighted the importance he placed on controlling the narrative of the encounter through his own documentation. "Your phone will be secured as personal property and either returned to you upon release or held as evidence if it contains relevant information about the incident," Sergeant Martinez explained, reiterating the standard procedure for handling personal items. The response maintained the transparent, procedural approach that had characterized the officers' handling of the situation from the beginning. "If you're concerned about the recording, I should note that all interactions in the terminal are captured by airport security cameras, and Officer Mendoza's body camera has recorded the entire encounter from initial contact through processing," he added, making it clear that multiple sources of documentation existed beyond Harrington's own recording. The mention of official documentation sources seemed to give Harrington pause, perhaps reminding him that his actions had been recorded from perspectives he couldn't control. "I understand," he said simply, his earlier insistence on his own narrative noticeably absent from his response. The acceptance of official documentation suggested a recognition that his sovereign citizen performance had been captured in its entirety by systems beyond his influence or editing. With all preparations complete, the officers began escorting Harrington from the airport police office toward the secure exit where the transport vehicle waited. "We're exiting through a non-public area," Mendoza explained as they moved through a corridor marked "Authorized Personnel Only." The route was standard for transferring detained individuals, avoiding public areas of the terminal to minimize both spectacle and security concerns. As they walked, Harrington remained notably quiet, his earlier theatrical declarations about natural rights and corporate jurisdiction replaced by contemplative silence. The transformation in his demeanor suggested a significant shift in his perspective from the performative confidence of his sovereign citizen persona to the more subdued recognition of his actual legal situation. The contrast between his behavior in the terminal and his current demeanor highlighted the gap between sovereign citizen theory and the reality of law enforcement response. 3 hours after Harrington's transfer from the airport police facility, Officer Mendoza sat at her desk in the airport unit office, carefully reviewing the incident report she had prepared regarding the morning's events. The detailed documentation was essential both for potential prosecution and for departmental records of the encounter, particularly given Harrington's sovereign citizen affiliations, which often led to complex legal challenges and complaints against officers. 14 pages, she noted to herself, the length reflecting the unusual nature of the incident and Harrington's elaborate sovereign citizen performance throughout the encounter. Sergeant Martinez approached her desk, coffee cup in hand, his shift continuing alongside Mendoza's despite the early hour of their involvement with Harrington. "Just got word from Central Booking," he informed her, his tone conversational but professional. The update was standard procedure. Officers who arrested or detained individuals typically received notification when booking was completed and charges were formally processed. "They've finished processing Harrington, and the DA's office has accepted all 4 charges we recommended," he added, confirming that the district attorney had found sufficient evidence to proceed with the full range of charges stemming from the airport incident. Mendoza nodded, making a note in her report to reflect this development. Did they set bail? She asked, the question relevant both for completing her documentation and for anticipating whether Harrington would likely remain in custody until his arraignment. The bail decision would impact not only Harrington's immediate situation, but also potential security considerations at the airport if he were released before his court appearance. Judge set it at $20,000 to $500, Martinez replied, taking a sip of his coffee as he leaned against the edge of Mendoza's desk. The amount was standard for the level of charges involved, significant enough to ensure appearance, but not excessive, given the non-violent nature of the offenses. But here's the interesting part, he continued, his tone suggesting that the case had taken an unexpected turn. Apparently, Harrington doesn't want to post bail even though he could afford it, he explained, raising an eyebrow to emphasize the surprising development. Mendoza looked up from her report, her expression reflecting professional curiosity rather than personal investment in Harrington's decisions. Did they say why? She asked, though she could already formulate a hypothesis based on her experience with sovereign citizen behavior patterns. The refusal to post bail often aligned with sovereign citizen strategies of non-recognition or non-participation in conventional legal processes, part of their broader rejection of governmental authority. According to the booking officer, he's claiming that posting bail would constitute joinder with the corporate court system, Martinez confirmed, using air quotes around the sovereign citizen terminology that had characterized much of Harrington's rhetoric during their encounter. The explanation aligned with common sovereign citizen tactics, refusing to participate in standard legal procedures, based on the misguided belief that such refusal somehow negated the court's jurisdiction or authority. Mendoza shook her head slightly, returning her attention to her report. So he'd rather stay in jail than post a bond he can afford, based on a legal theory that has failed every time it's been tested in court, she observed, her tone reflecting neither judgment nor surprise, but simply an objective assessment of the situation. Her experience with sovereign citizen cases had made such seemingly counterproductive decisions familiar, if not entirely logical from a conventional legal perspective. Apparently his followers are already organizing outside the detention center, Martinez added, scrolling through his phone to check updates from colleagues at the central facility. The information was relevant from a security perspective. Sovereign citizen supporters sometimes created additional disruptions when one of their ideological leaders was detained, attempting to file spurious documents or flood departments with records requests and complaints. Mendoza made another note in her report, documenting this development as part of the overall incident record. How many? She asked, the question relevant for assessing potential security concerns if Harrington's case generated significant attention within the sovereign citizen community. The size and activity level of the gathering would inform departmental responses and resource allocation. About 20 so far, according to Central, Martinez replied, returning his phone to his pocket. The number was notable but not alarming, a vocal minority rather than a major demonstration that might require significant additional security measures. They're live streaming and calling themselves peaceful observers. But so far, they're staying within the designated public area, he added, providing context that suggested the situation remained under control despite the unwanted attention. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Elena Parker, the United Airlines gate agent, who had been directly involved in the initial confrontation with Harrington at Gate A4. "Excuse me, officers," she began, approaching Mendoza's desk with the confident demeanor of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. Her United Airlines uniform remained crisp despite the long day, though the fatigue of the morning's events was visible in her expression. "Ms. Parker," Mendoza acknowledged, rising from her chair to greet the airline employee who had played a crucial role in managing the gate area during Harrington's disruption. The professional courtesy reflected both respect for Parker's handling of the situation and recognition of the ongoing partnership between law enforcement and airline staff in maintaining airport security and operations. "What can we help you with?" she asked, gesturing for Parker to take a seat in the chair beside her desk. Parker settled into the offered chair, placing a folder on the edge of Mendoza's desk. "United Security Department asked me to provide you with some additional information that might be relevant to your case," she explained, her tone businesslike but cooperative. The collaborative approach between airlines and law enforcement was standard in airport environments where the intersection of private operations and public security required constant information sharing and coordination. "We appreciate that," Sergeant Martinez responded, remaining standing as he observed the interaction between Mendoza and Parker. The additional information could potentially strengthen the case against Harrington or provide context that would help in prosecuting the charges that had been filed. "What kind of information?" he asked, his interest professional rather than personal. Each piece of evidence or context improved the department's ability to address the incident comprehensively. Parker opened the folder, revealing several printed documents and what appeared to be screenshots from security footage. "It turns out this isn't Mr. Harrington's first attempt to board a United flight without a valid ticket," she stated, selecting a report from the collection and placing it on Mendoza's desk. The revelation of a pattern of behavior was significant both for the current case and for airline security protocols moving forward. "When and where did this happen?" Mendoza asked, examining the report that detailed a previous incident at Chicago O'Hare International Airport approximately 3 months earlier. The document was an internal United Airlines security report rather than a police record, suggesting that the previous incident might not have resulted in law enforcement involvement or formal charges. "He tried the same approach in Chicago in February," Parker explained, pointing to specific sections of the report that outlined Harrington's previous attempt. The details were strikingly similar to the current incident: presentation of invalid documentation, claims about verbal agreements, and sovereign citizen rhetoric when confronted by airline staff. "He was escorted from the gate by airport security but left before police arrived, so no formal charges were filed," she added, explaining why the incident hadn't appeared in law enforcement databases during their initial background check on Harrington. Sergeant Martinez leaned closer to examine the report over Mendoza's shoulder. "Does it mention his YouTube channel or live streaming?" he asked, the question relevant to establishing a pattern of deliberate provocations for social media content rather than genuine misunderstandings about ticketing requirements. The distinction was important for building a case that demonstrated premeditation and intent rather than confusion or error. Parker nodded, turning to the second page of the report. The security officer noted that he was recording the entire interaction and mentioned several times that he had thousands of viewers watching, she confirmed, pointing to the relevant section of the documentation. The detail corroborated the officer's assessment of Harrington's motivations during the Denver incident, creating content for his social media audience rather than legitimately attempting to travel. "This helps establish a pattern of behavior," Mendoza noted, making additional entries in her incident report to reflect this new information. The documented previous incident strengthened the case against Harrington by demonstrating that his actions in Denver were not isolated or accidental, but part of a deliberate strategy he had employed before. "Do you know if any other airlines have had similar experiences with him?" she asked, considering the possibility that Harrington might have targeted multiple carriers with his sovereign citizen performance. Parker produced another document from her folder. "Our security department checked with other airlines through the Airline Pilots Association Security Network," she explained, referencing the industry association that facilitated information sharing about security concerns among carriers. The collaborative approach allowed airlines to identify patterns of disruptive behavior that might target multiple companies rather than a single carrier. There is a report from Southwest about a similar incident at Las Vegas McCarran last December, and another from American at Dallas-Fort Worth in January, she continued, providing evidence of an escalating pattern of behavior across multiple airports and airlines. Sergeant Martinez whistled softly, the sound expressing professional recognition of the significance of this pattern rather than personal judgment of Harrington himself. So he's been working his way through major carriers and hubs, creating content for his channel, he observed, the evidence painting a picture of systematic rather than spontaneous behavior. The documentation of multiple incidents transformed the assessment of Harrington from a one-time disruptor to a serial provocateur who deliberately targeted airport operations for his sovereign citizen performances. It appears that way, Parker confirmed, her expression reflecting the seriousness with which the airline industry viewed such systematic disruptions. The pattern of behavior represented not just an inconvenience, but a potential security concern, particularly given Harrington's demonstrated willingness to attempt to breach secure areas like the jetway. United is preparing to add him to our internal watch list for enhanced screening at check-in, and we're sharing his information with other carriers through the Atlassian system, she added, outlining the airline's response to prevent future incidents. Mendoza nodded, appreciating the comprehensive approach to addressing the security concerns Harrington represented. This information will be valuable for the prosecutor, she noted, collecting the documents Parker had provided to be included with her report. The established pattern of behavior would likely influence both the prosecution's approach to the case and the court's assessment of appropriate consequences for Harrington's actions. One more thing, Parker added, producing a final document from her folder. Our operations department calculated the total cost of the delay caused by this morning's incident, she explained, presenting a detailed breakdown of expenses incurred as a direct result of Harrington's disruption at Gate A4. The financial impact analysis covered various categories, including crew overtime, fuel consumption during extended idle time, missed connection, accommodation costs, and administrative processing expenses. Sergeant Martinez examined the financial impact statement with professional interest. Total cost to United, $8,742, he read aloud, the figure representing a quantifiable impact of Harrington's disruptive behavior beyond the less tangible effects on passenger experience and airport operations. The documented financial harm could potentially lead to additional charges or civil recovery actions beyond the criminal charges already filed. We'll include this with the evidence for the prosecutor's office, Mendoza assured Parker, adding the financial impact statement to the growing collection of documentation related to the incident. The comprehensive approach reflected the department's commitment to thorough investigation and evidence gathering, particularly in cases involving deliberate disruption of critical infrastructure like airports. Parker nodded her appreciation of the officer's thoroughness and professionalism. United appreciates your prompt response this morning, she stated, her tone reflecting the collaborative relationship between airline staff and law enforcement that was essential to maintaining secure and efficient airport operations. The acknowledgment recognized the officer's role in preventing the situation from escalating further while minimizing disruption to other passengers and flights. We appreciate your cooperation and that of your team, Mendoza responded, the professional courtesy mutual rather than one-sided. The successful resolution of the incident had depended on effective coordination between airline staff and law enforcement, each fulfilling their respective roles while maintaining clear communication throughout the evolving situation. The way your gate agents handled the rebooking of passengers while we were dealing with Harrington was impressive, she added, acknowledging the operational effectiveness of the airline team under challenging circumstances. As Parker gathered her belongings to return to her duties, Martinez posed one final question that reflected both professional curiosity and practical security concerns. Has United seen an increase in these sovereign citizen-type incidents recently? He asked, the query relevant to departmental planning and resource allocation for airport security moving forward. Identifying emerging trends in disruptive behavior allowed law enforcement to develop appropriate responses and training before such incidents became more widespread. Parker paused, considering the question with the thoughtfulness of someone who had been in the industry long enough to recognize patterns. Over the past 18 months, definitely, she confirmed, her expression suggesting that the trend was concerning from an operational perspective. The timeline coincided with the post-pandemic return to normal travel volumes, but also with the rise of social media, auditing, and sovereign citizen content creators seeking confrontations for online audiences. Our corporate security has documented a 47% increase in incidents involving passengers using sovereign citizen terminology or tactics, she added, providing a specific metric that quantified the growing trend. Mendoza made a final note in her report, documenting this industry observation as context for the department's ongoing security planning. That aligns with what we've been seeing across various facilities, she acknowledged, the information confirming that Harrington's behavior represented not just an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern affecting airports nationwide. The recognition of the trend underscored the importance of appropriate training and protocols for responding to such incidents effectively, while minimizing disruption to airport operations. As Parker departed, Mendoza returned to completing her incident report, incorporating the new information provided by United Airlines into her comprehensive documentation of the morning's events. I'll email copies of these airline reports to the DA's office, she noted to Martinez, ensuring that the prosecution would have access to all relevant evidence and context for building their case against Harrington. The thoroughness reflected her professional commitment to proper documentation and effective case preparation. Good, Martinez replied, finishing his coffee as he prepared to return to his own duties. With this pattern established, they might look at upgrading some of the charges or adding federal counts, he observed, the accumulated evidence potentially justifying more serious charges than those initially filed. The documented history of similar incidents at multiple airports could transform the legal assessment of Harrington's behavior from isolated misdemeanor disruption to a pattern of deliberate interference with air transportation. 1 month after the incident at Denver International Airport, Officer Mendoza entered Courtroom 3B at the Denver County Courthouse, her uniform pressed and her demeanor professional as she prepared to testify in the case against Mitchell Harrington. The courtroom was modestly filled, primarily with court staff and a few curious observers, though a small group near the back appeared to be Harrington supporters based on their whispered comments and occasional glares toward the prosecution table. Quite a difference from his live stream audience, Mendoza thought to herself, noting that the real-world consequences of Harrington's sovereign citizen performance had attracted significantly less attention than his online theatrics. The bailiff called the court to order as Judge Eleanor Simmons entered, her experienced demeanor reflecting her 15 years on the bench. "All rise," the bailiff announced, the traditional formality establishing the official nature of the proceedings that were about to unfold. The ritual of court procedure stood in stark contrast to the pseudo-legal frameworks Harrington had attempted to invoke during his airport confrontation, the structured reality of the justice system replacing his sovereign citizen mythology with established law and procedure. Case number 2023 CR 1842, People v. Mitchell Edward Harrington, the clerk announced, formally opening the proceedings with the case identification that would enter the official record. The case number and formal legal title, People v. Harrington, rather than United States Corporation versus Mitchell Harrington, established the legitimate legal framework within which the charges would be addressed, regardless of Harrington's sovereign citizen beliefs about jurisdiction or authority. Mendoza observed Harrington at the defense table, his appearance notably different from their encounter at the airport. Gone was the navy blazer over a political T-shirt, replaced by a conventional charcoal suit that suggested an attempt to present a more traditional appearance to the court. More striking than his attire, however, was the absence of his sovereign citizen performance. No clipboard of homemade documents, no declarations about maritime law or strawman corporations, no theatrical pronouncements about natural rights or corporate jurisdiction. Mr. Harrington, you're charged with criminal trespass in a restricted area, disorderly conduct creating a public disturbance, obstruction of government operations, and resisting a peace officer, Judge Simmons stated, reading the charges that had been formally filed by the district attorney's office. The clear enumeration of specific statutory violations replaced the vague assertions about natural law and corporate policy that had characterized Harrington's rhetoric during the airport confrontation. The defense attorney, a public defender named Kevin Reynolds, who had been assigned to Harrington's case, rose to address the court. Your Honor, we've been in discussions with the district attorney's office regarding a potential plea agreement, he stated, his tone professional and matter-of-fact rather than adopting the grandiose declarations that had characterized Harrington's own legal theories. The statement confirmed what Mendoza had suspected. Faced with actual legal consequences, Harrington had abandoned his sovereign citizen approach in favor of conventional legal representation. Assistant District Attorney Maria Vasquez rose from the prosecution table. That's correct, Your Honor, she confirmed, her crisp blazer and confident demeanor reflecting her extensive experience prosecuting cases involving disruptive behavior in public facilities. We've offered Mr. Harrington the opportunity to plead guilty to disorderly conduct and obstruction of government operations with the remaining charges to be dismissed, she explained, outlining the proposed resolution that would allow Harrington to avoid trial while still accepting responsibility for his actions. Judge Simmons nodded, making a note on the file before her. "And what are the terms of this proposed agreement, Ms. Vasquez?" she inquired, seeking the specific details that would determine whether the court would accept the negotiated resolution. The judicial oversight ensured that any plea agreement would serve the interests of justice rather than merely convenience for the parties involved. The people are recommending a sentence of 2 years probation, 100 hours of community service at a transportation facility approved by the probation department, completion of an anger management program, and restitution to United Airlines in the amount of $8,142 for costs incurred due to the flight delay Mr. Harrington caused, Vasquez outlined, the proposed consequences addressing both punishment and rehabilitation while requiring concrete compensation for the financial harm resulting from Harrington's actions. Reynolds turned slightly toward his client, their brief exchange of glances, confirming that Harrington had been fully advised of and had accepted these terms. Your Honor, my client is prepared to accept this agreement and take responsibility for his actions, he stated, the declaration notably free of sovereign citizen terminology or claims about jurisdiction. The straightforward acceptance of conventional legal process represented a significant departure from Harrington's performance at the airport. Very well, Judge Simmons responded, turning her attention directly to Harrington. Mr. Harrington, please rise, she instructed, establishing the formal structure for the plea colloquy that would follow. The procedural requirement ensured that any guilty plea would be entered knowingly and voluntarily, with full understanding of the rights being waived and the consequences being accepted. Harrington stood, his posture noticeably subdued compared to his confrontational stance during the airport incident. "Yes, Your Honor," he responded simply. the absence of sovereign citizen declarations or pseudo-legal terminology striking in its contrast to his previous behavior. The transformation suggested that the reality of legal consequences had penetrated his ideological framework, replacing performance with pragmatic acceptance of the system he had previously claimed to reject. Mr. Harrington, do you understand that by pleading guilty to disorderly conduct and obstruction of government operations, you are waiving your right to a trial by jury, your right to confront witnesses against you, and your right to remain silent? Judge Simmons asked, beginning the standard colloquy that ensured any guilty plea met constitutional requirements for validity. The formal questioning established an official record of Harrington's knowing and voluntary acceptance of both the plea and its consequences. "Yes, Your Honor, I understand," Harrington responded clearly, his direct answer lacking any of the qualifications or declarations about natural persons versus strawman corporations that had characterized his interactions with authority at the airport. The simple acknowledgement of the court's authority and process represented a fundamental shift from his sovereign citizen performance to conventional legal participation. The judge continued through the required elements of the plea colloquy, ensuring that Harrington understood the charges, the potential penalties, the terms of the agreement, and the rights he was waiving by pleading guilty rather than proceeding to trial. Throughout the process, his responses remained straightforward and conventional, with no attempts to introduce sovereign citizen concepts or challenge the court's jurisdiction, as he had done so theatrically during his airport confrontation. "How do you plead to the charge of disorderly conduct in violation of Denver Municipal Code, Section 3889? Judge Simmons asked, reaching the actual entry of the plea that would establish Harrington's formal admission of guilt. The specific citation of the Municipal Code section represented the concrete legal reality that sovereign citizen ideology attempted to deny through elaborate but meaningless alternative frameworks. "Guilty, Your Honor," Harrington stated clearly, the simple declaration representing his acceptance of responsibility under the established legal system rather than the parallel pseudo-legal universe he had attempted to invoke during his confrontation with Officer Mendoza. The admission stood in stark contrast to his earlier insistence that such corporate statutes did not apply to him as a free inhabitant or natural person. "And how do you plead to the charge of obstruction of government operations in violation of Colorado Revised Statute 188-102? The judge continued, addressing the second charge included in the plea agreement. The formal citation of actual law, the democratically established statutory framework that governed conduct within the state, replaced Harrington's invented legal concepts about maritime jurisdiction and commercial contracts. "Guilty, Your Honor," Harrington repeated, completing his formal acceptance of responsibility for his actions at the airport 1 month earlier. The straightforward plea, free from sovereign citizen qualifications or declarations, confirmed his transition from ideological performance to practical engagement with the actual legal consequences of his behavior. With the formal entry of the guilty pleas complete, Judge Simmons proceeded to the sentencing phase of the proceeding. "Mr. Harrington, before I impose sentence according to the terms of the plea agreement, is there anything you wish to say to the court?" she asked, providing the standard opportunity for allocution that allowed defendants to address the court directly before sentencing. For a moment, Officer Mendoza wondered if Harrington might revert to his sovereign citizen persona for this final opportunity to speak in court. Instead, he surprised her with a response that suggested genuine reflection rather than ideological performance. "Your Honor, I want to apologize for my behavior at the airport," he began, his tone lacking the theatrical quality that had characterized his statements during the confrontation. "I disrupted operations, delayed a flight, and created problems for a lot of people who were just trying to do their jobs or travel to their destinations," he continued, acknowledging the concrete impacts of his actions rather than abstracting them through sovereign citizen ideology. Judge Simmons nodded slightly, neither interrupting nor visibly reacting to Harrington's statement. "Go on," she instructed simply, allowing him to complete his allocution without indicating whether his apparent contrition would influence the court's implementation of the negotiated plea agreement. "I've had a lot of time to think about this while my case was pending," Harrington continued, his gaze briefly dropping before returning to meet the judge's eyes. "What I thought was standing up for rights was really just creating problems for everyone around me," he admitted, the statement suggesting a level of self-awareness that had been notably absent during his airport performance. "I'm prepared to accept the consequences and make restitution for the costs I caused," he concluded, the straightforward acceptance of responsibility representing a significant departure from his earlier insistence on elaborate pseudo-legal frameworks to avoid accountability. "Thank you, Mr. Harrington," Judge Simmons responded, her tone neutral as she maintained the formal judicial demeanor appropriate to sentencing proceedings. The acknowledgment neither endorsed nor rejected Harrington's expression of remorse, preserving the court's objective assessment of the case based on the facts and applicable law rather than emotional responses to the defendant's statements. The judge turned her attention to the formal imposition of sentence according to the terms of the plea agreement. Having considered the nature of the offenses, the impact on airport operations and the traveling public, and the recommendations of counsel, I find the proposed plea agreement to be appropriate and in the interests of justice, she stated, establishing the court's acceptance of the negotiated resolution. The judicial approval transformed the agreement from a proposal between the parties to an official court order with full legal effect. Therefore, it is the judgment and sentence of this court that you, Mitchell Edward Harrington, having pled guilty to disorderly conduct and obstruction of government operations, be sentenced to 2 years of supervised probation, she continued, formally imposing the first component of the negotiated sentence. The probationary period would maintain court oversight of Harrington's behavior for an extended time, ensuring compliance with all conditions and immediate consequences for any violations. During that probation, you will complete 100 hours of community service at a transportation facility approved by the probation department, she added, specifying the community service component that would require Harrington to contribute positively to the very type of facility where he had created disruption. The condition represented a restorative justice approach, allowing Harrington to make amends through service rather than merely suffering punishment. You will complete an anger management program approved by the probation department within the first 6 months of your probation, Judge Simmons continued, addressing the rehabilitative component of the sentence that aimed to address underlying behavioral issues rather than simply punishing past actions. The requirement acknowledged that effective justice required not just consequences, but also opportunities for personal development and change. And you will pay restitution to United Airlines in the amount of $8,642 to be paid in monthly installments as determined by the probation department based on your financial circumstances, she added, imposing the financial compensation that would make the airline whole for the costs incurred due to Harrington's disruptive behavior. The restitution requirement ensured that the financial burden of his actions would fall on him rather than being absorbed by the company or passed on to other travelers through increased fares. "Do you understand these conditions, Mr. Harrington?" Judge Simmons asked, ensuring that the sentence was clearly communicated and acknowledged before concluding the proceedings. The clarity was essential, both for Harrington's compliance and for establishing an unambiguous record in case of future violations or appeals. "Yes, Your Honor, I understand," Harrington responded simply, his acknowledgement free from the sovereign citizen qualifications or declarations that had characterized his interaction with authority at the airport. The straightforward acceptance reflected his transition from ideological resistance to practical engagement with the actual legal system and its consequences. You have 30 days to file a notice of appeal if you wish to challenge any aspect of these proceedings, the judge informed him, completing the standard advisement of post-conviction rights that ensured due process continued beyond the entry of the guilty plea. The information provided Harrington with a clear understanding of his remaining legal options within the established judicial system. "I understand, Your Honor," Harrington acknowledged again, his tone suggesting that he had no intention of pursuing an appeal or further challenging the resolution of his case. The acceptance represented a final abandonment of the sovereign citizen. Approach that had characterized his airport confrontation, replaced by conventional engagement with the established legal process. With the formal components of the plea and sentencing complete, Judge Simmons concluded the proceedings. "You'll report to the probation department immediately following this hearing to process your probation paperwork and establish your reporting schedule," she instructed, ensuring a seamless transition from courtroom proceedings to ongoing supervision. The procedural clarity left no room for misunderstanding or evasion of the imposed conditions. "This matter is concluded," Judge Simmons declared, formally ending the court proceeding with the traditional judicial declaration. The bailiff called, "All rise," as the judge departed the bench, the courtroom returning to informal conversation and movement as the official proceeding concluded. The transition from formal judicial process to ordinary interaction mirrored Harrington's own journey from theatrical sovereign citizen performance to conventional legal compliance. As the courtroom cleared, Officer Mendoza gathered her notes and prepared to return to her duties at the airport, her testimony ultimately unnecessary due to Harrington's guilty plea. "Officer Mendoza," a voice called softly from behind her, prompting her to turn and find Harrington standing a respectful distance away, his public defender at his side. The encounter was unexpected. Defendants rarely initiated contact with the officers who had arrested them, particularly in cases involving confrontational behavior. "Mr. Harrington," Mendoza acknowledged professionally, neither friendly nor hostile, but maintaining the appropriate boundaries of her role as a law enforcement officer. The neutral greeting established a controlled framework for whatever interaction Harrington was initiating, ensuring that professional standards were maintained despite the unexpected nature of the contact. "I wanted to apologize to you directly," Harrington stated, his tone lacking the combative edge that had characterized their airport encounter. The direct apology was unexpected, particularly given his theatrical sovereign citizen performance during their previous interaction. "My behavior at the airport created problems for everyone, including you and Sergeant Martinez," he continued, acknowledging the impact of his actions on the officers rather than maintaining the adversarial framework he had attempted to establish during the confrontation. Mendoza maintained her professional demeanor, neither dismissing the apology nor offering personal absolution that might blur the boundaries between her official role and personal feelings. "I appreciate you taking responsibility, Mr. Harrington," she responded simply, acknowledging his statement without engaging in extended conversation that might complicate her potential future involvement in his case if probation violations or other issues arose. Harrington nodded, seeming to understand and respect the professional boundaries Mendoza was maintaining. "I'm going to complete all the requirements and put this behind me," he added, the statement suggesting a forward-looking perspective rather than continued fixation on sovereign citizen ideology or grievances about his arrest. The practical focus on fulfilling his obligations and moving forward represented a significant shift from his previous approach to authority and legal requirements. "That would be wise," Mendoza replied neutrally, neither encouraging nor discouraging his stated intention, but simply acknowledging it as information provided. The response maintained appropriate professional distance while allowing the interaction to conclude on a constructive note rather than reinforcing adversarial dynamics. "Good luck with your probation," she added as a final acknowledgement before gathering her materials to depart the courtroom. As Mendoza exited the building, she reflected on the stark contrast between Harrington's courthouse behavior and his airport performance 1 month earlier. The transformation from theatrical sovereign citizen to conventional defendant, accepting responsibility, demonstrated what she had observed repeatedly throughout her career. When confronted with the actual machinery of justice, rather than imagined legal loopholes, most sovereign citizens ultimately engaged with the real legal system rather than maintaining their alternative frameworks. Outside the courthouse, Mendoza spotted Sergeant Martinez waiting near their department vehicle, coffee cup in hand, as usual. "How did it go?" he called as she approached, clearly having waited to hear the outcome of the proceedings he had expected to involve her testimony. His presence reflected the partnership they had developed over years of working together at the airport unit, a professional relationship strengthened by shared experiences handling difficult situations like the Harrington incident. "He took a plea," Mendoza explained as she reached the vehicle, summarizing the unexpected resolution that had rendered her prepared testimony unnecessary. The efficiency of the outcome was professionally satisfying, even if it meant her careful preparation for court had ultimately not been required. 2 years probation, community service, anger management, and full restitution to United, she continued, outlining the key components of the sentence that had been imposed. Martinez nodded approvingly, the terms addressing both accountability and rehabilitation in a balanced approach to justice. "Sounds appropriate," he observed, opening the driver's side door to return to their duties at the airport. The pragmatic assessment reflected their shared professional perspective, concern with appropriate consequences rather than punishment for its own sake. The interesting part is that there wasn't a single mention of sovereign citizen ideology, maritime law, strawman corporations, or any of the other theories he was so passionate about at the airport, Mendoza noted as she settled into the passenger seat. The observation highlighting the fundamental disconnect between sovereign citizen performance and practical legal reality. The contrast revealed the essentially theatrical nature of many sovereign citizen confrontations, performances that typically evaporated when faced with actual legal consequences. Martinez chuckled softly as he started the engine, the sound expressing professional recognition rather than personal amusement at Harrington's situation. "They never bring that stuff into actual courtrooms," he observed, his decades of experience having shown the same pattern repeatedly. "All that sovereign citizen rhetoric works great for YouTube videos and impressing online followers, but it disappears pretty quickly when they're facing a real judge and actual charges," he added, the observation cutting to the heart of the disconnect between sovereign citizen theory and legal reality. As they drove back toward Denver International Airport to resume their regular duties, Mendoza reflected on the resolution of the Harrington case within the broader context of airport security and public order. The incident had been successfully managed, the disruption minimized, the perpetrator held accountable, and normal operations restored, all core objectives of their role in maintaining the safety and functionality of one of the nation's busiest transportation hubs. "Got a call from United's security department this morning," Martinez mentioned, as they approached the airport perimeter, sharing information relevant to their ongoing security responsibilities. They said Harrington's YouTube channel has a new video titled "Why I'm Taking a Break from First Amendment Auditing," he continued, the information suggesting that the consequences of the Denver incident had prompted some reassessment of Harrington's sovereign citizen activities. Mendoza raised an eyebrow, the subtle expression conveying professional interest without personal investment in Harrington's future choices. "Sounds like a step in the right direction," she observed neutrally, neither celebrating nor dismissing the apparent shift in his approach. The potential reduction in deliberately provocative behavior would benefit everyone involved: airport operations, travelers, airline staff, and law enforcement resources, while allowing Harrington himself to avoid further legal consequences for disruptive actions. One less sovereign citizen creating airport disruptions for social media content, Martinez agreed as they pulled into their designated parking area at the airport security facility. The practical assessment focused on the operational benefits of reduced disruption rather than ideological judgments about sovereign citizen beliefs. Though there's probably another one already planning their airport confrontation video for next week, he added realistically, acknowledging that Harrington represented a symptom rather than the cause of the broader trend they had observed. As they exited the vehicle and prepared to resume their regular patrol duties, Mendoza's radio crackled with a routine call about an unattended bag in Terminal C, an ordinary security matter requiring standard protocols rather than the unusual sovereign citizen confrontation they had handled a month earlier. "Back to normal operations," she commented to Martinez as they responded to the call, the transition from extraordinary incident to routine security matters, completing the restoration of order that had begun with Harrington's removal from Gate A4 30 days before. The resolution of the Harrington case exemplified the fundamental purpose of their role at Denver International Airport, not merely responding to disruptions, but restoring and maintaining the essential order that allowed thousands of travelers to move safely and efficiently through one of the nation's critical transportation hubs each day. Behind them, the airport's distinctive white tensile roof rose against the Colorado sky, its design suggesting both movement and stability, a fitting symbol for the balance between dynamic activity and structural order that characterized both the facility they protected and the legal system that had brought Mitchell Harrington's sovereign citizen performance to its inevitable conclusion.